Asking if there are questions, comments, reactions on where we're at, so to speak. Tonight's assignment in particular. Yeah.
This might be a question for the last hour of today, but in reference to this, to the end of Gamma especially, in kind of contrast to Jubileia, is a question of suffering and what I guess an ontology of suffering would be in the context of this infinite Eucharist or this Eucharistic experience. And if we could touch on that today, that would, I think, clarify a lot for me.
Okay. It may come up in the text, hopefully. Okay. Any other questions? Concerns? Oh, okay. Why don't we try and, as usual, back up a little bit. We mentioned it kind of after class last time, but we probably should take a little look at it in the text around page 362. The question of Mary, that is the Virgin Mary, or Mary, the mother of Jesus, and how she's seen in the context of the thinking now occurring. And on page 262, let's start on the fourth line. Even the world's absolute appropriation of sin itself is simply annihilated in this thinking, in which the historical reality of Christ, in essence, is seen to be the evidence of creation's being an act of absolute freedom, in which everything comes into existence without exception, without precluding exception in essence. Not that Christ himself, in essence, is that exception. Rather, Mary, the Virgin, is. And dropping down about 4 lines, she, the Virgin, is essentially implicated in the essential repetition of creation itself. For her, nothing existed in essence but God himself. In her being conceived before now in time without death in essence, extending even to the flesh, was perfectly prepared the way of the Messiah. Christ himself was no exception to being conceived before now, in essence, in time, as not being without death in essence. Indeed, he so suffered death in the flesh. If you put this in biblical terms, the simple, straightforward way in which it's put in the New Testament is that Jesus, or Christ, became sin. His becoming sin and then being crucified and being atoning in his own person for the sin of the world, by in effect embodying that sin in himself and bearing in effect the wrath of God. All of that is integrally essential to the notion of salvation. So in the context of this understanding, there is therefore this kind of distinction between Christ and Mary. Mary did not atone for the sin of the world. She did not become sin in order to do so. And quite the contrary, as it were, she is the exception in essence in the language of this text. And as I was saying informally last time, an easy and direct way of understanding that is that she embodies the notion, as certainly as it's understood in this thinking, she embodies the notion that the sinfulness of mankind, or the sinfulness of the world, is not intrinsic to human nature or intrinsic to nature in general, right? And therefore Mary is the exception in essence, which is to say that she is the exception to the sinful state of the world by way of demonstration, you see, of the fact that one of the other issues that's going on here, sometimes explicitly it emerges out of the text, sometimes it's subliminal, is the notion of freedom, right? That sin is a function of freedom. It's not to be equated with imperfection, the so-called imperfection of the natural world, or put it in terms that Hegel would understand. It's not to be confused with the finitude of being or the finitude of the creation. That is not its sinfulness. That in and of itself, and this has been said earlier, much earlier on in the text, I forget offhand which chapter, but probably in connection with something I was saying about Thomas, is that certainly in Thomas, I do connect with Thomas in this text, the notion of the creatureliness being created and being limited are not simply interchangeable terms in Thomas's understanding, right? In other words, the being a creature is the participation in the ipsum esse of God, the participation in being, right? The act of being as received in the act of creation is that which makes one a creature, and the fact that the participation in that being goes, how shall I say, hand in glove with the notion of finitude, right? With the notion of a multiplicity of beings, no one of which, therefore, is going to be being itself, right? That notion is, while it's inseparable, in fact, from the reception of the act of being by virtue of the creative will, it is not synonymous with the reception of the act of being. All right? In other words, limitation can be distinguished from the reception of the act of being, and you can see that negatively, or you can see the negative proof of that in the modern appropriation of the transcendental form of reason, where finitude becomes minus the reception of the act of being, right, independently of the explicit notion of creation ex nihilo. Finitude becomes, in effect, or maybe I put it another way, the creatureliness gets reduced to being finite, right? And in that context, you could say that finitude is all there is to the creature, would explain where Hegel is coming from. If finitude is all there is to be said, ultimately, in the context of self-consciousness, about what otherwise is the natural world, or the created world, or the world that is not the absolute divine, then creatureliness or worldliness takes on a notion of negativity. Right? It takes on a negative notion, and then if you, I think I've said this earlier too, one of the implications of that further would be that if being limited, as I'm going through this, I'm thinking, for example, we noted earlier on in the course that there's a transformation of the valuation of infinite and finite when we move from Aristotle into the Christian theological West, and then carrying that forward into the modern period. So that what I was about to say was, in Aristotle, in a very different context, and in a way that transcends the natural world, the divine is finite, and finite is good, and being not finite, being infinite, is the negative concept, because it suggests a lack of wholeness, a lack of intelligibility, a lack of formality, you see? Okay. And so you have this kind of really interesting, deep paradox going on, that when we go from Aristotle into the created world of the Christian thought of the medieval period, both theological and philosophical thought, all of a sudden the infinite, as you see this reflected, it's still reflected importantly in Descartes' Meditations, you see, and therefore the difference between Descartes and Hegel is profoundly important to understand what happens as we go through modernity. But even in Descartes' Meditations, you see a reflection of the fact that that one of the reasons he's convinced in Meditation 3, actually the reason he's convinced in Meditation 3 that God is a real being, is that he explicitly understands the infinite being of which he has an idea to be an idea of infinite being as positive infinity, not negative infinity, not a deprivation or not a negation of the finite, you see? But as he has a notion that God is, in some positive sense, unlimited, not simply the negation of a finite experience of the world, right? Yeah.
Where does that flip-flop in the evaluation of infinity occur? Has it occurred in Augustine, for instance?
No, I don't think so. No, I don't think so. No, I think I would say it begins to occur. It's clear to me that it occurs in Hegel. It's fundamental to Hegel. And he may be the first one who makes it.
No, I mean the first flip-flop, the positive evaluation of infinity.
When we move from
the Greek notion of
yes.
as being a positiveness form.
Yeah, okay.
Is it late Neoplatonism? I mean, like, is it in do you have in the late Neoplatonics a positive evaluation of a pairon? Maybe you do.
Yes, I think that's true. Yeah. I think that's true. Except that in Neoplatonism in general, because of the hierarchical structure that we talked about, whatever positive infinity, whatever positive notion of not being limited is nevertheless, it's above and beyond, all right? In other words, it's the ultimate property of the one, let's say in Plotinus, all right? And therefore cannot be reconciled, cannot be identified with, certainly, anything below it, so to speak, all right? I think you need to get to Christianity implicitly in Augustine. When Augustine says there's only one proper use of the word essence, properly speaking, only God is essence, right? But that's a way of, see, in other words, the interesting thing about that is that God is in being exclusively the one God, he is now, in that sense, implicitly, I would say, the infinite being, and at the same time, infinitely intelligible. In other words, in Christian doctrine and in Augustine and in Thomas, the infinite being, or the infinite one, if you want, in Neoplatonic terms, is now able to be understood to be at once mind, or what becomes more explicitly clear, reason, an absolute or infinite reason, which would not be the case in the Neoplatonic tradition, because the infinite would be beyond the formality of reason, right? So here you have, I think, in the Christian tradition, an infinite reason develops. I think it's there in Augustine. It's perfectly explicit to me in Thomas.
I wonder how early it enters into Kabbalistic writings, for instance, because you do have certainly contemporary with Aquinas the notion of the ultimate Godhead being an infinite. But I'm not sure how early that term, the Ein Sof, enters in. Okay, so this is a question for
okay. I don't want to go down that path, but I think it's a different. The Ein Sof, I would see as a problem in this case.
A different infinity.
Yes, I think so. It has again that kind of negative infinity. It's a mystical.
Well, it's mystical. But
yeah. Okay.
It's negative. It's not negative.
Well, I don't mean negative in a disparaging sense. I mean technically negative.
In the sense of negative theology.
Yes. Okay. Right. Exactly. Whereas, while there is in the medieval tradition, there are a lot of mystics, right? Thomas Aquinas' thinking is not mystical, right? And I think it's also fair to say that Augustine's thinking is not mystical, strictly speaking, all right? Although they have some tendency. All right, that could be argued, but certainly when you get to
the earliest of the Kabbalistic.
Well, I'll tell you later. Why don't we go?
Okay, we're going to get side.
That question.
What are we asking?
What was the earliest of the Kabbalistic thinking that is? I mean, since your use of the Kabbalah
I don't use the Kabbalah really.
Well, you really do, but I mean, the whole idea that you can equate statements in the Bible to numbers is a Kabbalistic notion. It may not be exclusively one, but I just wanted to...
Right. Well, the mathematical... I don't know how to answer the question exactly. In other words, there is in ancient literature, generally speaking, a dealing with the text in one way or another in terms of what appears to be deliberate mathematical framework and construct. Right? The Kabbalistic tradition, and if you mean by that the gematria, is what I think you're talking about, the relationship between the letters of words and numbers, that's something that grows up, I think, in a kind of, at least in my knowledge, in a kind of mist. I mean, it emerges.
By something like the 6th century in the Sefer Yetzirah, you already have that notion is there. How much earlier than that it is, nobody knows.
Yeah, in other words, it goes back into a kind of gray, mystic area.
Most famously, it's 14th century, isn't it?
Well, that's where it's full-blown. It's full-blown there.
Right.
So something has happened over the previous 1,000
So,
years.
But there
to
were...
the extent there's any historical coincidence, legitimacy, whatever, to the mathematical side of the thinking now occurring, as evidenced in Foundation. That, to that extent, I'm trying to date it for my own.
You can date it from 1980. When was that book published? No, Foundation was published in 1996, so you can date it from 1996. Actually, you can date it from 80s because I was working on it right before it was published.
Yes.
But since you're getting a little bit off the track here, but it's okay. But since you raised it, I have to address it. Mm-hmm. In other words, the whole point of what you're referring to as the Kabbalistic elements in Foundation absolutely are not Kabbalistic. Right? They are superficially reminiscent of the gematria of the Kabbalists. Right? But the whole point of it is the Kabbalists never did deal with the language in the mathematical way in which it is done for the first time in Foundation. Right? And the difference is the Kabbalists would add up the values of the letters and do other things. And I think sometimes they might multiply the value, but the typical way is just to add up the value to get the letters, to give you the sum total, right, of the mathematics of the word.
It wasn't
typical.
rational.
It was literally not rational. That is, the whole point of the analysis in Foundation is to see the sequence of the letters as a sequence of ratios, or to see the language and its mathematical underpinnings or structure in terms of proportionality. Right? And that was when I first met Wolfson. My book was going to press, since we're on this little digression, and he was an authority. And I had done my own research, but I figured there was no harm asking, right? And he confirmed that, right? That is unprecedented. So the rationale, the strictly rational nature of the use of the mathematics vis-a-vis the language in Foundation is an integral part of the novelty of the thinking now occurring. Right? It's not totally unprecedented, but now if we switch back to the philosophical plane, as opposed to the gematriac plane, the thinking now occurring is not in every way unprecedented, obviously not, right? It makes reference to and it depends upon.
Fibonacci.
Yes, a lot of, right, exactly, right. But how do we get into this?
Excuse myself.
We're back
No. I'm anxious because I want to
cover. Get you anywhere.
All right, but the Fibonacci thing, you see, again, the point in Foundation is yes, the Fibonacci mathematics is fundamental. That's not new. That goes back to the Greeks. The Greeks kind of discovered that, I think, the golden section, as they call it. But the logic, the trinary logic, the real trinary logic in Foundation, what the novelty there is that it is the logical root of the golden section, of the Fibonacci golden section ratio, right? So what we're trying to do here is to clarify conceptually what the ultimate intelligibility of the relative intelligibility that we've had going on historically in the world for some thousands of years, right? So it's not like coming out of nowhere altogether. On the other hand, it is a clarification, and the logic is understood to clarify ordinary mathematics. And even though within the field of ordinary mathematics, the golden section ratio is an extraordinarily unique ratio mathematically in ordinary mathematics, it, along with the ordinary mathematics, in which it is an extraordinarily exceptional ratio, that the whole point is to clarify what is within that limit still unclarified, so that the logic clarifies the mathematics, including the golden section is the basic notion. But I think it's another course. Yeah.
Just a very quick question.
Yeah.
Several times you've said mystic as opposed to,
Right.
not a mystic, not mystical, etc. And I'm just wondering if, in what sense, if you could just give a working mystical as opposed to what? Philosophical, mystical as
Right. Probably mystic as opposed to philosophical, meaning broadly speaking, I think you can think of the mystical tendency is, depending on the context, Neoplatonic context, the flight of the alone to the alone, a being beyond, in the case of Plotinus, even being is right, being beyond being and beyond truth and beyond the mind, right? Or in terms of Roberta Roberts, a kind of movement into the unknown, okay? And her text makes clear a movement, therefore, beyond formality and specification and a continuing differentiation. So the mystical unity tends to be, I think, in all traditions, something beyond what certainly would be philosophy or thinking or knowledge, or to put it even more directly, beyond science. So the thinking now occurring would be mysticism, except that it presents itself as not easily, but perfectly intelligible.
Beyond the distinction apophatic and cataphatic.
Okay. Yes.
That's
All right.
the point,
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
And so it's not apophatic in that sense, but it's
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And I think something of the something. So what's something? I mean, it's kind of paradoxical that something that might tempt you to think of it as a form of mysticism has something to do with the immediacy of the perception.
Yes.
Do you see? And yet, the immediacy of perception is not at the. It's not understood to be at the expense of specification. Quite the contrary, if I can put it that way. All right. All right, and in its own way, I guess it all wraps back here. Let's see if I can pick up where I was.
You're in the middle of 362.
Yeah. All right, so it was then a little below the middle of the page. In Mary, the bondmaid of God, in her person that the faith of Israel was consummate. For her, the Messiah was everything. In her very being was planted the seed of faith itself in essence. In her perfect submission to the will of God, this young woman came in the course of time through the evidence of the Spirit to a knowledge of the very righteousness of God, a knowledge which, since it encountered nowhere in Mary's exceptional being, resistance in essence, bore fruit in the person of Jesus. In Jesus, in turn, the infinite meekness of God is beheld now immediately in essence, without being an exception. Indeed, now in the form of the body itself is seen everywhere the form of man. The proof of the possibility of the transparency of the Eucharistic essence of existence itself, now occurring for the first time in history, is the virgin birth. No proof of the actuality of what now occurs is possible other than the perception, in essence, of the fact itself. So I think I said elsewhere, I think in today's assignment somewhere, I probably used the expression proof positive of existence. That could be the predicate of the thinking now occurring. The thinking now occurring is, for the first time, the proof positive of existence. So it's the kind of proof, actually, proof comes from demonstration, monstro. We think of proof as a very Latin thing, but the basic idea of a proof is to show. To show, that's to prove it. Do you see? To show it. So if you have a thinking in which the identity of the thought is the object, absolutely and essentially the object is the identity of the of thought, then the proof of existence, the showing of existence, is positive, right? And in that sense, I think it's I'm thinking about this in a number of different ways, but in that sense, it gets beyond the inferential nature of the Hegelian dialectic. So when we say that, and you asked me a question last time, Chuck did, because I used the word in a number of different places in here, nullification, annulment, and so forth, and is that in the Hegelian sense? And I say yes, and yes it is, except that if there is an absolute nullification of faith, right, then that's as if we could have what Hegel achieves without going through the inferential or syllogistic movement of the Hegelian dialectic. All right, that is, the movement in Hegel, the syllogistic movement in Hegel, is what I was referring to as the continuing schema. All right, the continuing lack of a medium. All right. So Hegel, it's the mediation, the continuing necessity of mediation in Hegel, which is absent in the thinking now occurring. So in that sense, for want of a better term, if one can imagine or conceive of a nullification, which is, in the language of this particular section, gamma, it's an absolute nullification. It's as if each of the elements of the Hegel, I say as if, I have a big grain of salt here, but as if, for openers, each of the three elements of the Hegelian syllogism annulled itself. And in that sense,
liberated itself.
Came into being, as it were, on its own, independently. And that when I say that, I already begin to think of my friend Peirce, you see, who is not able to go quite that far, but has already opened up in Western thought the notion that the three Hegelian elements are not able to be finally reduced to one. Right? In other words, Peirce accuses Hegel's three of really being one. Right? And in a certain sense, that's quite right. I mean, in other words, Hegel wants to say, when all is said and done, these three give us, these are the moments, you see, of the absolute unity of self-knowledge, and that's an absolutely closed system, and in that sense, it's a absolutely eternal actuality, even though internally, as we were saying in a different context, it's profoundly and infinitely dynamic. You see, all of that creative activity that takes place in a kind of internal infinity, which is the good infinity for Hegel, is nevertheless encapsulated in an actuality that itself had no beginning and will have no end, or is not subject to change. So when Peirce does his critique, although he didn't start out, by the way, he points out, it's very interesting, he points out he had a great respect for Hegel, but he wants to say that Peirce's understanding of the three categories, firstness, secondness, and thirdness, although very similar to Hegel's, and that's correct, he has no argument about that, he did not derive his understanding of the relationship of those three categories from Hegel, or even in a critique of Hegel. He derived it independently, and then noticed, we could say, how he could explain the difference between what these three categories meant in American pragmatism and what they meant in Hegel. And the basic difference is that so I can try and close this circle, that in the firstness, secondness, and thirdness of American pragmatism, as Peirce lays it out, these three, yes, they go together. They're inextricably found together in the world of our experience and in our consciousness of that world. They certainly are. And in that sense, you can't separate them. But on the other hand, they can never simply be reduced to one thing. That secondness is never Aufhebung, as he says, right? And firstness never ultimately goes away, even though ideally we would have only a secondness identified with a thirdness in the ideal long run, right? Spontaneity will have exhausted possibility, all of which will have been realized, would leave no more need for firstness, but the point is in Peirce that that's never going to actually happen, so that the point being there, we're always going to have a real continuing difference between the three basic categories of consciousness in Peirce. All right. So what I was starting to say was the position of thinking now occurring historically by way of explanation. Okay. Not again playing off Peirce, not by way of origination, right? Just as his thinking did not originate in Hegel, the thinking now occurring doesn't originate in American thought in the deep sense of the word. But on the other hand, by way of explanation, we can notice that that in Peirce, as opposed to Hegel, instead of we having three that are really just one, right? In Peirce, we have three that maintain their distinctness eternally, so to speak, indefinitely might be better, for always, right? Even though they cannot be really separated from one another, they remain distinct. And what I want to say, the analogy would be in the thinking now occurring, the absolute annulment would be attributable to each of those moments itself, right? So that their coexistence, as it were, would become a matter of a kind of perfect, or as I sometimes use the phrase, an absolute coincidence. Or, if that sounds too coincidental, a more positive way of saying it, that their coexistence is a function or a matter of an absolute freedom, right? An absolute immediate relationship is the basic notion.
So, you're using annulment and nullification identically. You don't have a distinction there.
Yeah, I don't think there's. I mean, there may be a subtle one. I would say my answer to you is probably effectively identical. Probably.
Now, does this? I'm sorry if I do this, but it's here. Does the nullification of inference, as you see it in the logical context of Hegel, and then differently in relationship to the Peircean inference, does it apply also, is it actually thought through in terms of modern logic? Since you did mention Boole and something of that 19th century history, obviously logic has had a rather spectacular development in the last 100 years.
Right.
And have you actually thought through its relationship to issues within modern logic?
If I'm hearing you correctly, I think the answer is no. I haven't. Right.
I may have some notes to give you.
Okay. All right. On page 363, just a couple of lines above about the middle of that page. God, in essence, is entirely compatible with essential perfection in the form of the creature, so disposed in absolute freedom. The direct evidence of the fact itself of creation, of the absolute freedom in which death, in essence, entered the world, there being in the Lamb of God explicitly the demand for perfection heard in essence. In the context of what we're saying here, God, in essence, is entirely compatible with essential perfection in the form of the creature. This goes back to something I found myself getting into because it's in the thought. You see, in other words, in the thinking now occurring, if it has been for 400 or 500 years, implicit or explicit, that there's some kind of, and it's absolutely explicit in Hegel, that there's some kind of incompatibility ultimately between the continuing being, right, of the creature and God, right? God can undergo the non-being of nature in Hegel, right? But God in Hegel cannot tolerate, so to speak, I mean this intellectually, technically, the idea of God cannot tolerate the continuing, the real being of the finite. Do you see? That's his revolution, right? And I guess going back to what I heard in an earlier question without remembering exactly how to tie it in, because I was mishearing your question. You want to go back. I was going forward on the question of the transvaluation of the finite and the infinite. Yeah. In modern thought, Hegel makes that absolutely clear, right? That the finite is a nothingness that is really ultimately incompatible with the being of the infinite, except insofar as it's an abyss, so to speak, undergone by the infinite to, as it were, prove, right? It's not a proof positive, but it's the absolute proof negative, do you see, of existence itself in Hegel. The absolute undergoes the abyss. It undergoes, as it were, the moment of its own nothingness in order to demonstrate, to prove, right, that it is, the infinite is, you see. And you can say, well, who is it proving it to? And that's the whole point, to itself. You see, it's self-realization. It's because there's nothing outside of the absolute self-consciousness, right? So, to whom is the proof offered? it's a proof that it's offered to itself. It's a kind of absolute self-discovery, if you want. Might be a way of understanding it. Okay. So
you do have two things in the modern world. On the one hand, you have a huge history of a struggle about this very question of the infinite, since the concept of the infinite undergoes this enormous elaboration in the last 100 years, but also a tremendous resistance to that. So you have, finitism as an interpretation of the infinite, that there is no infinite that would have this relationship to the finite. That's one. And the other is the Hegelian psychoanalysts, for whom exactly this self-proving of the deity becomes the model for human neurosis.
Okay. All right.
Just quickly.
All right. Toward the bottom of 363, maybe 10 lines up from the bottom, the world is itself everywhere the body of God in the form of man, a conception of essential perfection, not yet annulled in fact, that is, not yet absolutely unconditioned, but remaining for the time being the penultimate repetition of the end. Dropping another sentence down. In the transcendental repetition of creation itself now occurring, the spiritual reality of the Church, in essence, is conceived to be the absolute nullification of the Trinity, now occurring for the first time in thought. Not therefore, and actually this is quite relevant to what I've been saying, phrased differently, not therefore the relative nullification, as in that thinking belonging in essence to the past. So you could understand here, for example, chief example would be Hegel, right? That in Hegel there is a nullification of the Trinity, but relative to the thinking now occurring, it is a relative as opposed to an absolute nullification. This repetition is the absolute nullification of the historical structure of being itself, involving thought itself for the first time in history. The body itself of God, the actuality of an essentially new universe now in thought. Essentially the spirit dwelling in the temple. God is in fact being there in the absolute nullification of God. A conception in essence even now nullified in fact, but remaining still formally this absolute coincidence of faith itself with possibility itself. Not yet the substantial transformation of time itself into motion itself in the absolute indifference of being itself annulled. Not yet the absolute other being of life itself. All right.
Can you say something about other being, how you're using it right there? The notion of other seems to change in different contexts.
Okay. Well, here I think I speak of what? The absolute other being of life itself? Yeah, right. Actually, we touched on, we kind of did it last time a little bit. We tried to, we adverted to it.
Okay.
But hey, repetition, that's one of the things the Jesuits understood, that the key to education is repetition. Just keep saying it over and over again, and finally you might get it. So, if the thinking now occurring, so to speak, right, actually, is an alternative, as it were, to self-consciousness, to an absolute self-consciousness. It's a kind of absolute other consciousness, an absolute objectivity, an absolute differentiation, so that the relationship between entities or persons is a relationship between two others without any reference to the others being other than some self somewhere. Right? Okay, that notion. All right. So then the absolute other being of life that's being pointed to here has to do with a continuing distinction that's acknowledged in Gamma between the beginning of the resurrection, which is the thinking now occurring, and the resurrection itself, that which is referred to here as the not yet. So the resurrection itself is comprehended, but it is comprehended, if I could put it this way, in the form of the not yet. Okay? But that is the resurrection itself in how can I put it? In an unqualified way, right? To the extent we make that. So the absolute other being of life itself, in this particular context, has reference to an otherness. I think of how I was phrasing it last time in the text and in class, an otherness that is so, as it were, absolutely unqualified as to be beyond any necessity of referencing the other. So we're at a point now where we have an absolute otherness which is beyond referencing self. Take that absolute otherness to the point, a kind of absolute materialization, an absolutely unqualified materialization of what is now, for the first time, conceivable, right? Its unqualified materialization would be the point at which it's beyond, or we are beyond, the necessity even to make reference to the otherness that will be all there is. That all there is will be this otherness, right? And it will, as I was saying last time, one of the implications here, which I think comes out further on in today's reading, actually, is that it will be, in a certain sense, a deification and divination, right, of the creation and of the individuals participating in that ultimate resurrection itself. So if you think, I'm not entirely, but I mean, I'm drawn to Barth on this particular, for openness at least, right? In other words, Barth never gets, Karl Barth, the neo-Orthodox theologian, he came on the scene like a bolt of lightning around 1919, 1920, when he put out his commentary on Paul's epistle to the Romans, in which he emphasized in an absolutely uncompromising way, theologically, the absolute otherness of God. So to put it in short and sweet, what Barth was saying in a very powerful way was that not only outside of Revelation is there no understanding of God, which you could, okay. But Barth's point was, outside of Revelation, there's no, and this is what I like about it, and this is why the thinking now occurring feels nice about Barth, even though he couldn't get beyond his anti-Hegelian subjectivity. But just take it one step at a time. Barth is saying, in the early 20th century, outside of Revelation, there's not only no true understanding of God, there's no true understanding of man. There's no true understanding of anything. Right? So the powerful move that Barth makes, and it reminds me a little bit of Altizer in the sense that his move is limited by virtue of the fact that he makes this absolute critique of the whole of a Hegelian absolute self-consciousness, in effect, do you see? But he does so explicitly, and you'll pardon me for saying so, self-avowedly as a theologian. Okay? In other words, he conducts a radical critique, in effect, of modern philosophy, modern self-consciousness, but insofar as he restricts his critique, the authority for his critique, to being the authority that he has as the spokesman of the church in the ecclesiastical and theological sense, to that extent he betrays what? He betrays, from the point of view of the thinking now occurring in the preface, the foundation, that he hasn't gotten beyond the distinction between philosophy and theology. He's still self-conscious. Right? Now, what does he do theologically? It's great. Okay? Human self-consciousness isn't worth damn. Okay? The only truth about God and the only truth about human nature comes from God himself, and there's nothing. In other words, all of the. I mean, this is why Thomas Aquinas is the Antichrist for Barth. Because Thomas is in the tradition. In fact, Thomas, we could agree on the facts, not on the evaluation. We could agree, right? The thinking now occurring is saying is that Thomas has created the setup for modernity. He hasn't made that move. He has no intention of making the move. He probably couldn't even imagine making such a move. Okay, but Descartes didn't come out of nowhere, and Hegel didn't come out of nowhere either, right? So when Barth looks back on the predicament that he sees the world has gotten into, and by the way, this is not just an academic issue for Barth, right? He was a Swiss theologian who spoke German and who lived in the Nazi era, and who was involved in on-the-ground, day-to-day battles that he was engaged in, the whole attempt of which was to keep Nazism out of the church and keep the church out of Nazism, right? Which was largely a failure. Right?
Which church is Barth?
Well, he's a reformed.
Dutch Reformed?
Well, I don't know. No, it wouldn't be Dutch Reformed. It would be Swiss Reformed. He's an original Calvinist.
Yeah.
But the point being, since I'm on this, just a little indication that thinking has consequences. the reason he was so passionate about this was that he wanted to say that there is only, it reminds me of Augustine. Augustine said, strictly speaking, there's only one essence, and that's God. Strictly speaking, there are no other essences. Translate that into broader terms, there's only one Lord, right? Any believer should know that, right? But Bob wanted to take that in an absolutely uncompromising intellectual way. Do you see? With the one exception that the authority for doing so was strictly theological, okay? But nevertheless, there's only one Lord. And as soon as you admit that there's Jesus Christ the Lord, and then there are other lords, well then why not the Führer? Mm-hmm. Do you see?
Sure.
Okay, so this was Barth. So Barth, for this was not an academic exercise for Barth. In other words, he saw that what he would call natural theology, right, of which Augustine is guilty, Thomas is guilty, and from Barth's point of view, even the Reformers were guilty in some respects, insofar as their Reformation did not go all the way.
They tried to reproduce the hierarchy each generation.
Yeah, and so, it wasn't radical enough. So he takes it all the way. Now, I want to come back to the original question, but on the way back, I want to say, so when he looks at the source of the true understanding of God and of nature, and of what it means to be human, as coming only from the revealed Word of God, right? There's no other way to get it. You can't get it through meditation, you can't get it through any natural means whatsoever. Well, what can we say about this source then? Well, it turns out that this absolutely other God is an absolutely other subjectivity. And that's explicit in Barth. Okay? In other words, Barth's problem is not with subjectivity. He wants to confine. There's only one Lord. There's only one subjectivity. And that's the subjectivity of a God who is absolutely unavailable to us unless he should reveal himself to us in Revelation. You see, that's where he's at. So in that sense, he undercuts theologically the whole of modern self-consciousness, but is caught up in it himself by his projection onto the absolute other of a subjectivity. Right? Now, all of which I think is relevant here somehow or other. But so as far as that goes, as far as the otherness of God goes, I'll close the circle. As far as the absolute otherness of the divine goes, then the thinking now occurring is in agreement with Barth. But when Barth wants to understand that otherness as the true and only true subjectivity, you see, what he has done, think of Kierkegaard, and they're in the same ballpark. Right? And Barth is dependent on Kierkegaard, but he's not totally satisfied with Kierkegaard, but it's his starting place, intellectually, historically. One of his starting places, but an important one. And the difference, so the analogy in Kierkegaard is what? That my subjectivity as the existing individual human being is the truth for Kierkegaard, as opposed to the Hegelian absolute idea, right? The existential subjectivity of the believer in the case of the philosophical fragments. And what Barth has done is he has de-existentialized that, as it were, or he has generalized. That's not right. He has projected that individual truth of the believer in Kierkegaard. He has made that the cosmic truth, right? Right. And so you understand? Okay. All right. Now there was something I wanted to pay some attention to here because I became very impressed with how important this idea is, which I think I actually skipped over the first appearance in the text, so we'll probably look back at it at some point. And that is this notion of substitution that's going on here. And it occurs in a number of different places. And it's tied in with this other very fundamental notion that's come up in the last couple of classes of the schema, going back to my kind of oversimplified camera analogy, the schema or the idea, or in the case of Peirce, the symbol coming in between. So the removal of that gets us into a place, as it were, where the thinking now occurring has nothing in between it and the object, which now becomes the identity of that thought, right? So there's a kind of absolute immediacy of the thinking now occurring for the first time. But as I'm reading this, I'm reminded to point. I can't this is a great thing about using your own text. I can apply to this my pedagogical conscience, right? So in other words, you must always be faithful to the text. I mean, that's the rule. If you're going to talk about the text, you have to talk about the text, right? And so to be faithful to the text, it became clearer and clearer to me as I was preparing, especially this class, but also the last class. It was beginning to dawn on me. Something I think that needs to be said, which I may have said it, or it may have been implicit in what I was saying, but it needs to be made explicit, that the notion of taking the schema away is a little bit misleading as to what the thinking now occurring is really saying here. It's actually crazier than that. Okay? That, to put it short and sweet, then we can try and find it in the text, the basic notion I think that needs to be made clear is it's not so much that the schema, and this goes back to the objection that I've heard coming on a couple of occasions from that corner of the room, that there is a kind of, there's a question of whether, how can you refer to certain apparent achievements of modernity as indications that there's an essentially new form of thinking, right? So if you talk about genetic engineering or superconductivity and so forth and so on, it's kind of types of the immediacy and the power of the creativity of consciousness at this point in history. Well, isn't that the work of modernity, right? So I have a couple of things. I also have a comic thing occurred to me. This might help also. And it reminds me a little bit of, this would be a really comic book version of Kierkegaard, as applied to the thinking now occurring after Bart. And that's the cartoon we've all seen, and I forget who it is. What is it, the Roadrunner? Where one of these buggers is chasing another around the mountain, and all of a sudden he runs off the edge of the cliff. And then, of course, in the cartoon, there's a certain moment of suspense. He's still kind of going, and then he stops, right? And he looks down, right? Okay, and that's a big joke. Of course, that's the story of the walking underwater. You see? And Peter actually was walking on the water until he looked down, right? Okay. Now, to walk on the water or to go off the cliff and not plummet to the ground requires, to put it simply, faith, right? Or, if you want to think about it, it requires a thinking now occurring. In other words, to keep from falling, right? And the thinking now occurring deprives you of the weight. Who said weight? Focus on weight one day in here. No, I do. But I mean, somebody called it to my. Oh, I think it was Nancy. All right. So not something or other by its own weight in the text, right? Okay. So if the weight of self-consciousness, right? If one might imagine a thinking from which has been evacuated altogether the weight of self-consciousness, then there's no need, so to speak, to fall. You see? And then that would be a whole new comic story, right? That would be a whole new episode, but it's something like that, all right? So to tie it in with the historical analogy made me think of that particular one, right? To give the devil his due, to give modern self-consciousness its due, you see? As I said in a different context earlier on, it has in effect been engaged in a clarification of thought for some hundreds of years, right? It has, in a certain sense, clarified thought, and I said up to the point that it has never been able to, because as a matter of principle it cannot, right? It has never gotten rid of that fundamental opaqueness at its center, which is the self, to which it keeps referring its clearing project, right? It keeps referring it to itself in that sense, and that's the opacity, right? So in the thinking now occurring, get rid of that, right, and have an absolutely clarified consciousness, free of the weight of its own self-reference, you see. And that's compatible with the notion, not that modernity achieved nothing, you see, but it by no means, in principle, was it able to achieve all that it might achieve, right? And in fact, it was. I would say that the thinking now occurring is saying something like, there are now no limits, right? Now, here's, to close another circle which comes up in today's reading, there are no limits to the finite. So that in the thinking now occurring, which is said, it's not directly, almost directly in this text, I think it is effectively direct, I'm not sure I can quote it this way, but I can re-say it, that in the thinking now occurring, the finite is essentially infinite. Right? The finite is essentially without limit. You see? So not only is there no Hegelian-like contrast between the nothingness of the finite and the being of the infinite, you see, but the being of the finite is the infinite. I almost want to say that well, yes, I say it in here, don't I? The infinite shares the finite, or shares in the finite, you see. So the participation, maybe now this is, I don't think it's in the text exactly, explicitly, but it might be there explicitly, not in these words. But not only does the finite participate in the creative being, its act of being is a participation in the being of ipsum esse, of being itself. It's not only that the creature participates in the creator's being, speaking a little bit loosely, but that the creator is participating, right? And that's the incarnational element, the irreducible incarnational element here. And now what's being said, but it's taking it one more step. In other words, if I put it in terms, which I do in effect say here, if I put it in theological or biblical terms, what's being said here is the thinking now occurring is the beginning of the resurrection. Another way of saying it's the beginning of the descent of the New Jerusalem. It's the beginning of that condition in which there is no temple in the city, but God and the Lamb are the temple. All right? And in that context, not only is the divine participation in the creature as it is easily, so to speak, in the notion of the incarnation, but if I can put it this way, God is, as it were, God as a whole, right, is more involved, right, in this situation because the incarnation has precipitated a transformation of the creation, we having arrived at a point where it is, as it were, if I put it in Thomistic terms, now suitable that the whole of the divinity should be present, participating in the creation as a kind of further extension by effectiveness, you see, of the initial entrance, as it were, in the incarnation. So the transformation of the world now deeply involves the divine being in finite being.
So evacuated of self-consciousness,
right,
the creature that's where the distinction being and beings is overcome. Because
yes.
the participation in being is no longer makes sense to say what is the creature and what is the creator. It is being existence. One is being, and not simply a being, because the participation is now. There's no gap between the creation, the participation of the finite being in the infinite to be.
I just want to. The reason I was about to interrupt you there was that I heard you following a very tempting simplification, namely that there's no longer. How did you put it? There's no longer a being, but which one did you suppress?
I suppressed the word continuity just for your sake.
Yeah. Okay. Without going over your particular phrase, let me say what I thought I heard you say, and then fix it in terms of thinking now occurring. That there is, in fact, I have it here, but I can't put my finger on it immediately. But we'll hopefully get to it. I speak somewhere, in effect, if you can hold your fingers there on 368 and jump over to 390. And just hopefully we'll come back to this section, but toward the bottom of 390, about 9 lines up from the bottom, the substantial transaction of the mass is the absolute individuation of existence itself. Let me pause there. All right. So an absolute individuation of existence itself, absolute individuation, going to the notion of this kind of absolute differentiation, a kind of infinite number of others, no one of which is defined with any self-referential framework, right? Okay. Absolute distribution, or absolute individuation of existence itself. Indeed, recollection itself is now seen for the first time to be essentially historical, to be the distribution of being itself in fact. so I made a note, distribution of being itself, in fact, the transcendence of the ontological difference, right? So being itself, and the thinking now occurring, is understood itself to have been absolutely distributed. So when I do this, which somehow or other I have a compulsion to do, right? The point I want to make is, in terms of what I heard you saying, it's not that each of these is being as opposed to
A being.
Yeah, as opposed to a being,
Yeah.
but that the opposition between being and a being, right, is
gone.
passé. It belongs to the bed.
Each being is being as a being.
Yes, right. And that now, in order to make some sense of that, one has to again now introduce this notion that the identity of thought is the object, right? So that we don't, right? There is a difference here. There is a distinction between being and a being, but it's not a distinction. How can I put this? It's not a distinction in being.
Yes. I understand. I work with this pseudo-distinction or quasi-distinction that everything that appears to be. That is to say, every appearance is utterly determinate, but it's in the very structure of what an appearance is.
Right.
That it has a unique relationship to being, not in the sense that it's not what itself and there's this other thing which is its true being as a model for itself over there.
Right.
But in anything, at whatever level, whether it's at the level of perception, the level of logic, at the level of a thought, the level of a representation, in every case, anything that appears as something that's distinct, and it appears to be. You can't think of an appearance apart from that internal yoking of relationship, and that yoking is unique and it has no other. It has no contrast. There is no something else that would be a wedge between being's opposite is not appearance.
Mm-hmm.
Appearance is opposite is not being.
Right.
Because as soon as you create that distinction, the distinction disappears. Since you don't find being apart from the appearances, and you don't find appearances apart from that yoking to being.
All right. Can we get rid of the yoking?
Well, no, okay, that's just a metaphor.
Okay,
Yeah.
all right.
He's just joking.
Let's go back to 368 because I want to again. This I pointed to it, but I haven't done it yet. So let me. In fact, while we're on 368, let me go back to the first time I noticed this issue in rereading the text, and that's on page 350. I think we did go over this on page 350, 351. Okay, on page we probably went over it, but let's just take a look at it again, and then jump back to 368. On page 351, what is dropping down about 6 or 7 lines? What is seen to be now is not simply existence completely changed in appearance, but the appearance itself of existence completely changed in itself. It is the perfect abstract understanding of the absolute essence of existence, suffering itself, perceiving itself existing in the form of the other. The perfection of this abstraction is the perception of existence itself. Now that's not the, that's relevant, but there's one other, I'm probably not going to be able to. Okay, I'll just say it. Somebody may know where it is. I can't pin my pen. Yeah, 336. All right, these are all things to keep in mind. 336, I'll close this particular circle. Modern thought, again about 15 lines down, 336. Modern thought is a similitude in essence of the essential implication of Jesus the Nazarene. All right. Now, all of these texts are relevant to what's going on page 368. On page 368, third line, in the form of the essential conversion of the world now occurring, the individual in essence is opened out as a flower is exposed in its heart into the community of saints. Essentially, he is transformed into the perfect substitute itself, being in essence at the disposal of another without being in essence for another. All right, let me see if I can try and sort out what I'm trying to bring out here. Go back to the notion of the schema, which covers a lot of ground, right? The schema, the idea, the representation, the symbol in the case of purse, anything that mediates, right, anything that, in effect, denies the immediacy of the identity of the object with the perception or the conception of the object or with thought. Right? And I said, my metaphor that I've been using is, well, get rid of the schema, and you have that immediate identity of the object as the identity of thought. But the getting rid of it is, this is what I want to clarify. Okay, the getting rid of it is not a matter of just pulling it out of the way and throwing it in the wastebasket. Right? What's going on here is a transformation of reality, and therefore a transformation, a change in the schema itself. You see, so that, right, in one sense, the schema goes away, right? But in another sense, going back to what I was saying about going so fast that you're 10 feet out off the cliff before you notice that if you're still self-conscious, you're gonna kill yourself, right? You're out there. In terms of this idea, you're out there. In other words, the schema, the similitude to what Jesus of Nazareth is in essence. That similitude that modern thought is not simply thrown away here, but it's transformed. You say. Now, what? I mean, it's kind of so simple. I said when I first did this, and Ali raised the question right away, Descartes is in the process, I said, somehow or other, reconstructing the world. And he does so, ironically, by abstracting himself, in effect, from his world, his body and his world and so forth. But he's doing this not out of any kind of pathology, but he has a very definite intention, scientific intention. He means, by means of this abstraction, he means to create a new science that's going to have practical, useful, it's going to be utilitarian, beneficial science precisely for the world. So the reconstruction of the world is done through a self-abstraction, right? And it turns out, whether we like it or not, or whether, I mean, you can't, just a matter of fact, it turns out somehow or other fundamentally to work, right? In other words, that, right? By reconstructing the world in the form of this abstraction, actually, what appeared to be, certainly to Aristotle, a simply given reality, a simply objective reality, do you see? Now seems to be something that could be, put it simply, crudely, manipulated and constructively manipulated, right? Transformed, in effect, changed for the better, hopefully, at least, all right, ideally, all right? So the thinking now occurring, yes, it gets rid of the representational character. It gets rid of the ideal character of the perception of reality, you see, not by simply discarding it and returning to an immediacy that one might be tempted erroneously to think was what Aristotle was experiencing. In other words, you see what I'm saying? In other words, you could say, well, modernity put an idea in between the given nature and the self-consciousness, right? And if we get rid of that, we can go back, become happy Aristotelians again, right? But then, of course, all the lights would go out, right? And so that's not what we're talking about, right? So in other words, so if we're taking the schema out, we're really better metaphor. I don't know what the best metaphor is, but better. It's going away because what's happening is, by the grace of God, you see, minus the self-referential weight, the weight of self-consciousness, the schema is able, actually, in essence, to be no different from the immediate reality. It's that, right? It's that kind of thing. So the really deep thing that's going on here is if you want, I'll make a you concession. I don't mean it. A continuation of the creation of the world. You see, it is really, it's a deepening. Better, I would like that better. Something, a deepening in a very shallowing way, right? In absolute superficiality. Well, I'm saddled with this language. Right?
Use the word deep once every 15 pages. Nobody will think that you're Altai.
Right? But in other words, it is maybe a perfecting. You see, of the reconstructive attempt of modernity get rid of the re. I always like. I'm guilty of it a couple of times here. I would erase it now. It's the construction of the world now is no longer simply a reconstruction. It is immediately from the get-go. Right? Consciousness is the construction of what a modern would say of its own immediacy, but that's the whole point. It's not its own immediacy, and that's where the objective identity of the immediacy that consciousness is constructing is not its own, right? And that's so it is at one and the same time a kind of unqualified, creative, constructive power of this otherwise perfectly immediate and what might appear at first glance to be passive reception, you see, but and this is where Mary comes in, you see, her passivity, as it were, vis-a-vis the angel's announcement, right, was what? It was the beginning of the transformation of the world. It was the beginning of the sharing of the finite by the infinite. Creative power, all right? So the thinking has that quality about it, right? That in one way it is perfectly receptive of an immediacy, but not an original, right? Not an immediacy before self-consciousness, but as it were, and there's a kind of cosmic reflection or echo of something in Kierkegaard, it's an immediacy after self-consciousness, in which the immediacy is its own. Say no, but that's all right. It is what it constructs, but what it constructs is not its own. It's not its own doing, right? And therefore, it can have, in that sense, no. And to pull that off, that is to stay afloat 20 feet beyond the edge of the cliff, right? The only way you could pull that off is not to be self-conscious, right? It's just to keep doing, right? Action is the solution to the,
The version of that cartoon in Roger Rabbit.
Okay.
If anybody knows that amazing metaphysical work, where the cartoons and the humans interact for the first time in history. That the moment of them running out on the thing and falling down, the human runs out along with Mickey Mouse and Goofy and starts falling. And Goofy and Mickey Mouse don't have any problem about falling, but the human is sort of completely freaked out, and he can't figure out, and you can't figure out, is he in the human world or is he in the cartoon world? And if you think of the cartoon world as the schema,
Okay.
that's something about the problem. And I said Roger Rabbit doesn't quite solve the problem, but it really focuses on it.
Okay. All right.
Well, this is all very amusing, but this is what happened to the German nation. They ran right off the cliff, and they would have kept going if a schema called democracy hadn't checked them. And this immediacy that you keep talking about is, I think Hitler would love it, and I think a future Hitler will seize on this. If you're after you're not around anymore, we know your benevolence, right?
Don't be so sure.
And we know the good intentions of this group, but this reduction of all of the things that I believe have created our imperfect freedoms, all the schema that somehow or other we could advert to and talk about and adjust, all those things are going to go away in this thinking if anybody really takes it seriously. Luckily, probably nobody will. But you have this problem.
Well, you put up, you did pay to be here.
You have this problem of an arbitrary, Leahy says this, forget all those distinctions, we're just happily there. That's where we are. You can't fit a thought, a control. So helpful to the future totalitarian. This is perfect for it.
No,
Because I see. Let me finish. Right? I see this. It's right there. What's the argument? That was the whole point about Hitler. The whole point about Caesar. There are no arguments.
Well, there were a couple of million Russians there. It wasn't just democracy, and something called the Winter.
Fair enough. But they had their own reasons. We'll retreat until, just like the Egyptians, we'll retreat for the snow savers.
Well,
But put aside for a second that kind of thing. There is a recipe here for the more I've heard about this over all the years I've heard about it. There's a recipe here for rejection of law, as it's classically understood, rejection of schema, whatever you want to call them, and there's an immediacy here that is beyond question. And that's the frightening thing about this thinking now, Karen.
well, okay. First of all, you made a similar objection the last time you were here.
Sorry.
And that's all right. No, that's fine. I want to recall it to bring it up here. In other words, and the first thing I would say to your objection is that it's like objecting to something simply because it can be misused. I mean, I don't know where you stand on the gun issue, but I don't want to get into the gun issue, but take it for instance, right? A gun, the people who are against gun control, they'll say, well, guns don't kill people, people kill people, right? So in other words,
So you're in favor of guns?
That's not the point. The point is,
I don't own a gun. I don't know about you. You live out in the woods there. You probably need one.
well, according to you, I do. The point being that the instruments are neutral. They can be used for good or ill. The police have guns, and they presumably, okay. And the Americans had guns when they stormed Normandy. Damn good thing they did, isn't it? All right. And they used their guns in order to liberate France and Europe and save the world for democracy. Okay. So anything that's useful can be misused. So it's not a.
But this can be misused absolutely.
Well, but then if that's true, then it must be an absolutely useful thing.
It may not make sense to say it can be misused. I just want to figure out how to raise this question in a slightly different way, which is, and I just don't know how to do it, but it has something to do with, the political theorist, the whole tradition of normative thinking that absolutely relies on models and sees them as necessary for human whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's really what your question is, without giving a particular example of Hitler or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So
Could I say something else? I think that we've allowed this to fall down into a level which is at another level from the claim of the thinking now occurring itself,
That's right.
which is much crazier.
Yeah.
And because it's crazier not at the point of, I am propagating this idea that I think everybody ought to adopt.
Exactly.
It's that, hey, this is what's happening. And here I'm sort of stuck my flag up in the wind and watch it blow. And even if there were no such thing as Novitas Mundi and the Foundation, this is the event that's happening. So, I mean,
Right.
that's the actual claim, which is really crazier than the idea of expounding and propagating a doctrine which might have deleterious effects because it contradicts democratic notions of what kinds of ideas we should be willing to accept. So,
Except for the fact that if what we're asked to do here is to move from Descartes, from modernism, if you will, from modern thinking, which has demonstrable benefits, to this system, which basically says, well, that's okay, but what we really have to confront now is a transcendence of everything
but maybe it's
that
not
has
something
given
we're
us
being asked to do.
penicillin and
That's
everything
right.
else. Oh yes, we are. We are being asked to. I mean, either we're being asked to do it, or one doesn't take any of this seriously.
Well,
If this is just speculation, this is just something we do for a couple hours a week or whatever. I mean, my problem with this is I take it seriously.
Yeah, okay, but this is
That's
I
my
do
problem.
too. I do too, but and I've struggled with exactly the same question over these years and going back and forth. But where I'm sort of thinking that it's happening is, okay, here's Leahy's version of the thinking now occurring. Now there's you over there, you're thinking, and that thinking is occurring too. And then suddenly it reads this, and for some crazy reason, it understands some of it. It doesn't understand all, but the more you focus on it, the more, it's like depends on the state of my own neurons, well, whether how much of it I understand at any given moment or not. It's kind of amazing that way. But the question is, if what's being said here is what it says it is, it doesn't make any difference whether we accept it or not. It isn't like a doctrine that's being promulgated for our delectation and for our approval, about which we're going to add our opinion.
It's not another schema.
It's not another schema. What its actual value is in relationship to our thinking now occurring, that's kind of remains to be seen. And that's, at least in my case, that's
well,
where
I
it
agree
is.
that
I'm
it's
not
not.
sure.
I agree with the observation that you're making, and I think Nancy was making, that this is not. This is a kind of like a category mistake. In other words, it's not. It's not a doctrine. It's not something that Leahy is saying. I mean, I'm sitting here, but it says in principle that it's not personal, because it's an expression of beyond that kind of self-distinction.
Does the saying make it so?
Yes, the saying says itself. It's right.
But it doesn't. But the saying of it, saying does not make it so unless you are willing to discard the schema. And so.
Well, if you're not willing to
looking at this,
wait a minute, if you're not willing to discard the schema, then if you're a schemer, right? If you're a schemer, if you're somebody who uses schemes, then this will not. You can't use this. You cannot use this. This is not a weapon.
Oh yes, you
Great.
can use it.
Well,
magnificently.
How?
You can use it absolutely.
But it would be very hard to. It's not like anybody's fancy doctrine, which can be paraphrased and dumbed down and put into some rhetorical context to bolster something.
Hitler's
whole
whole project was based on Germany above all, right? Let's get rid of all the Slavs and the Jews and the Catholics and so forth and so on. It was based on
Revenge.
Yeah, and it was deeply based on the distinction between us and them.
Well,
he did not attract a following by, hey, this would not. If he got up and read this, in Berlin Square, there would have been no Heil Hitler's going on.
It's so easy. I'm just like,
Can I say something about this? Just, even your claim to democracy, I think, is it's still caught up in the world where the thing that you're referring to that is the schema that's going to keep us out of this kind of thinking, falling into the hands of Hitler or something like that. I'm kind of losing my point, but democracy, as you're saying, is still just an idea. It's not something that actually is existing. It doesn't. Look what our country's doing. It's there's still that distinction between us and them that is foundational to how this country is acting in the world right now. So this does get rid of that distinction as a form of thought. So if you're actually being in that form of thought, then true democracy actually would be possible. It's actually of the I don't know what it would be called at that point, but it would certainly not be democracy. We wouldn't be killing people in the name of democracy.
This is the point where you now have to talk about Antichrist, because certainly at the point where Antichrist appears, after all the other dichotomies have fallen away, I start wondering if I understood anything. So that's what you have to do.
All right. All right. Well, we have some extra time to come back at this particular issue, but let's try and go through the text a little further if we can. On page, since we're on this point of the substitute,
We were going to understand the substitute.
We're going to
I
try.
didn't get it from what you, from what you said so far.
You didn't.
No, but I might have.
Okay. All right.
The substitution, he's transformed into the perfect substitute itself. So right at the top of 368 there, the fourth line.
Right.
So so that I was just waiting
Okay.
to see if it was going to clarify for me, and it didn't yet.
Okay. All right. One clarification or attempt at clarification in the text itself, following that comma, is being in essence at the disposal of another, without being in essence for another. All right. So the perfect substitute. Is, as it were, being in essence at the disposal of another, without being for another, again, eliminating the distance between others that are for one another, right? Mm-hmm. And therefore, if I eliminate that distance or eliminate adverting to that distance, I'm now dealing with another, which it's being said here in a certain sense is what it is by virtue of a perfect substitution, right? And that perfect substitute, let me emphasize the word perfect here a moment to get, because I think that's probably the key word, because there are all kinds of substitutes, right? But a perfect substitute would be a substitute, if it's perfect, there's no possibility of discovering the substitution, right? In other words, a perfect substitute would be, as it were, a repetition, right? Or, in terms of the Hegelian-like language, the absolute nullification of each moment, right? Or an absolutely differentiated nullification would be such that the consequence of a absolute nullification would be a perfect substitution of the... See, I'm hesitating because it's near impossible to avoid the language that we have inherited. Perfect substitute would be after the, as it were, the absolutely differentiated nullification, it would be, as it were, and this is where I'm getting hung up, but I'll say it and I'll take it back, the same thing, the same one, right? But completely different. Right? In other words, the more radical notion in here that enables or is related to the notion of perfect substitution is the notion that change is not an alternative to identity. That identity itself undergoes, in the thinking now occurring, a change. If I put that a little more, make it a little more accessible, I think in here somewhere I say, in effect, if I don't say it literally, I think I pretty much say it literally, that the divine itself, God himself changes. Here I give you a big idea, which is no idea, which I also was thinking about in preparing this particular section. And it's nice because it kind of is the right time for this idea to come, right? Go back to Augustine. Remember I said that Augustine has two chief ways of understanding the divine. It's immutable and simple. So simplicity and immutability. And I did say at the time, I wanted to make a big issue out of it because I was interested in emphasizing the simplicity in Augustine's notion of God as simplicity, which I tied in with the fact that you can have one God who is nevertheless three persons that are really distinct, really different. You can have a really differentiated unity, which in no way detracts from unity. You really have to be simplicity itself to pull that one off. That's Augustine's basic thought, and he may not phrase it the way I just did. And I said at the time, and of course, immutability, when Augustine said God was immutable, that was not news. Plato would understand that. Aristotle. But the thinking now occurring says, oh, really? Oh, really? Oh, maybe these people keep accusing you of being a Neoplatonist. Oh, right. In other words, in the thinking now occurring, God now is not simplicity itself and immutability. God is absolute, unqualified simplicity. And absolutely, so relatively speaking,
doesn't have to be immutable.
Exactly. Looking back at Augustine's notion that God is simplicity itself and immutability itself, if I do to Augustine what I love to do to Hegel, so let's be fair, right? Hey, if he was that simple, he wouldn't have to be immutable. So he's not quite so simple. You see, so in other words, Augustine is not a self-conscious modern, but Augustine is the first autobiographer. In other words, both in Augustine and even more clearly in the language of Thomas, self-consciousness is growing, right? So to be beyond self-consciousness is to be beyond the reflection of even the implicit self-consciousness in Augustine's characterization of the divine as simple, but not so simple that it is mutable. Right? So if you can have three persons who are one God, then the extreme of the situation historically in the thinking now occurring is that change is not something that is incompatible with the absolute simplicity that the divine is.
It seems
and so to go back to the earlier thing we were talking about, and in that way we can logically, if I can put it that way, understand how it is that the divine now, in a way which is penultimately final, participates in, shares in finitude. Right? And in a certain sense, I want to give some credit, a little bit, guarded credit to Heidegger, you see, because in Heidegger, being is already finite. There's a finitude of being, you see. So again, it's not like there's no anticipation, no preparation whatsoever for the extreme move here, all right, of the thinking now occurring. There is a kind of anticipation, but here it comes together, I would say, seamlessly. I don't mean easily, but there's a perfect clarity to what's being said here. If you can distinguish that for a moment from the ineptitude of a particular part of the text, if you know what I'm saying. Okay. So, but in principle, this works seamlessly. So the absolute simplicity. So here, I can kill a couple of birds with one stone. So the absolute simplicity of the divine and the thinking now occurring is not only not an alternative to the absolute simplicity that we referred to, the absolute particularity of persons beyond self-consciousness, right? Where the Kierkegaardian Den en Kelta is no longer an absurd, if I can put it that way, an absurd ideal, right? It's no longer existing the abstraction in a way which is naturally impossible, you see, but the absolutely unqualified divine simplicity is not an alternative to the perfect simplicity of personality at this stage in history. I'm on the way to saying it's the same thing, but it ain't the same thing. It's a perfect substitution.
Right.
You see, for the absolute simplicity of personality, what is perfectly substituted for the persons who were there prior to this absolutely differentiated annulment in the language of Gamma. What is substituted? The divine simplicity is substituted, right? But perfectly so, right? Because it's no skin off the Creator's nose, you see, to have a creation which is perfectly and absolutely independent. Is it dangerous? You bet it's dangerous. Absolutely. We're in agreement on that. It's very, very dangerous. See? But freedom is dangerous. Freedom is very dangerous. Right? To be free is a dangerous predicament. Right? It's the predicament of existence itself. Okay? It's all right. So that's.
Wait. But
okay.
If danger comes up in the sense of, so if we're running off a cliff, but because of this absolute objectivity, we don't fall.
Right.
What immediately comes to mind is this kind of notion of Eden, or Garden of Eden sort of situation where we've got, once you eat the fruit of knowledge, you've got to leave the Garden of Eden. But now it seems, and this is probably obvious to those of you who work in this language, but now it seems that the thinking now occurring is almost a sense of now the Garden of, you can eat the fruit of knowledge in the Garden of Eden. It's all just the Garden of Eden, and with knowledge, in the sense that...
Right, okay.
But to extend that further, and I think this is the flavor of the text, is that we now have to be able to run off the cliff
right.
and have self-consciousness and still not fall. In other words, the simplicity has to be pushed into not making a distinction between. I mean, the self-consciousness has to be also objectivity in that sense. You know, because the knowledge, it is scientific in the sense.
Right.
We're not, or it's not a return to ignorance, and we don't fall because we're like Peter. We didn't look down at first.
Right.
We can look down.
Right.
See that we're walking, understand, have knowledge,
Right.
and still not fall in this sense.
Okay, and the way you just phrased it reminds me of something which one of my criticisms of Roberta Roberts' text on experience of no self. She does what I think you just did effectively. Whether you did it deliberately or not, I'm not sure. I would say yes, there is consciousness. So if I look at the Garden of Eden from the point of view of self-consciousness, from Hegel's point of view, who's an authority, you could say that the Garden of Eden was precisely before self-consciousness. It was only in disobedience. You see, it reminds me of Peirce's idea, which I was talking about last time, that self-consciousness, the child becomes aware of itself when it begins to notice its own ignorance and tendency to be in error compared to the word, the description of reality gets from others, adults or whomever around it, right? It begins to learn that when mommy says the stove is hot, son of a gun, she's right, but I would have been, right? So I become aware of myself and the limitations of myself, right? Okay. Hegel's version of that in biblical terms is that it was with disobedience, it was the introduction of the negative that was actually a necessary moment in growth, right? And the beginning of knowledge and so on. All right. And so Roberts, in her book, also equates, that is, I say equates, I don't think she makes a big, deliberate philosophical issue out of it. She just takes for granted, uncritically, assumes, and uses, therefore, interchangeably, the terms consciousness and self-consciousness. Do you see? And so the thinking now occurring would be a continuing, it would not be a return to Eden if we mean by that some kind of dreaming, unconsciousness or pre-consciousness or something like that. So but in terms of what I was saying half an hour or so ago, it's not self-consciousness, but it's better than self-consciousness because it is a perfectly clarified consciousness that is minus the self-reference. See? And so in that sense, it's a more perfect way of knowing if we're going to. I'm not crazy about the way of putting it, but
does
that make sense? Does that respond to what
it
you're?
It does. I guess I just wanted to push further into the notion of individuation and particularity, and that I would submit maybe that's what I was associating the notion of self-consciousness in the sense that consciousness isn't just kind of amorphous or vague, but has this particular, like you're saying, clarification,
Okay.
specificity of even a being off the cliff, not just.
That's right. That's right. Except that you're making the one level down assumption, akin to assuming that the only kind of positive consciousness, constructive consciousness, must be self-consciousness. Analogously, I think you just equated particularity, specificity, with self. So I want to say the person is a self, is not a self. The person is, however, a particular. The person is a simple one. No longer in an ideal sense, no longer in the Kierkegaardian sense of a subjectivity at odds with its own nature, its own natural being, but I have a kind of perfect particularity, a perfect simplicity of personality, and therefore a clarified consciousness. And so if you're trying to reduce it to practical dealings, which what I'm hearing, right, I'm dealing with other people, right, I hear in your question or whatever, an objection which the thinking now occurring says we're beyond. In other words, you seem to feel that we can only deal effectively with one another self-consciously, and the thinking now occurring is saying we can deal with one another without any reference to self. I could just take your otherness as a reality and deal with you accordingly.
I'm definitely comfortable with that.
I think
that's not my objection, but
okay.
You've already clarified what I think I was saying.
At this point of description of these characteristics, the problematics of enlightenment in the Buddhist concepts are identical.
Yes.
Exactly these questions come up
Yeah, that's
with
where
anybody who is working with these things, whether it's Zen master or Tibetan. Exactly.
Okay.
And against the cartoon version of mysticism, the problem of differentiation without reabsorption is also the problem.
Mm-hmm.
That is to say, there is always this question of what happened, how are things articulated after the compulsive separation off that's caused by the ego structure is in some sense dissolved. A certain structure is dissolved, but the differentiation hasn't been dissolved.
Mm-hmm.
Did Christ, when he walked this earth, have a self-consciousness that he's since lost?
Well, when Christ walked this earth, he spoke in. He really became a human being, right? That's right. So when he was walking this earth, he was a Jew, who I guess was every day speaking Aramaic or something like that.
Sure.
And so he spoke a certain language, and therefore his way of speaking would have been affected in some way by the consciousness of the time in which he was, in which he existed. So I would say, maybe in some, I want to make this distinction. I would say, and I would use the Gospel of John in particular to make the point vividly, that I think there are passages, in fact I quote some in a different context, not for this reason, but where you could say, well, there's a certain self-consciousness involved in what he's saying to his disciples. I don't think it's a very heavy self-consciousness, but I don't want to quibble, let's say this a little bit. But then, of course, remember, doctrinally, this one person is both true human and true divinity, right? So when you look at the Gospel of John, for example, he's not speaking self-consciously, clearly not, when he says, I am who am, or I am, or one of the things I quote in this, I guess it must come from the Gospel of John, I am the resurrection and so forth. Those kind of I am statements, right, in the context, are his way, linguistically, of identifying his person with the divine person, and that's why he was a stumbling block. That was blasphemy, in other words. Okay, so in that sense, he would not have been speaking self-consciously. So did he sometimes speak self-consciously and sometimes not? That's what I would say. And to the extent to which he spoke self-consciously, he was reflecting the stage of human consciousness of his day. And to the extent to which he didn't, he spoke beyond that. He spoke as the qua incarnate word. Right?
Right. But now has he, as a human being,
right,
which he still is,
right, transfigured,
yes,
glorified.
Right. Has he now, in becoming thought, has he now overcome that self-consciousness?
Well, to the same extent that we are in the process of overcoming it, willy-nilly.
So it's not clear which way it's going to go.
No, what do you mean? It was that clear which way it's going to go.
Well, we're willy-nilly.
No, we're willy-nilly. In other words, we go back to the comment that Chuck. What the text is saying is that there's something occurring in the form of consciousness. This something occurring in the form of consciousness is something essential. It's a change, and that change is occurring willy-nilly, whether we like it or not, whether we intend it or not. The text is saying this is an objective occurrence in history. So, to that extent, to the extent to which, if we accept the text for the sake of argument a moment, the implication of that would be that the humanity of Christ, to the extent to which it survives now in a slightly different form, embodies this change, I would say, just as our humanity embodies a change. And then, of course, I have to right away go on to say, and at this point, in this text, the distinction between the humanity of Christ and the glorified humanity of Christ and the humanity of the people sitting around this table is no longer as simply clear-cut as it might at first sight appear to either to have been or to be. So I think that's the answer. Okay. 374, the substitute idea comes up again somewhere here. And the bottom half of 374, well, actually, just starting a little above the bottom half, the bloodshed of the Lamb of God, in which, and oh, by the way, let me just say that while I'm thinking of it. And of course, another level of substitute here is that the whole purpose of the symbol of the Lamb is the substitution, which I referred to in another context indirectly by the identification of Christ as sin. He becomes sin. All right. So the lamb embodies the sin. The lamb is a substitution, right? And if you read the Epistle to the Hebrews, the theology of the Epistle to the Hebrews is that the reason the Word had to become flesh and become itself the lamb was that all of the lambs that have been offered up in the temple all these years, every
all the time.
Right. It's an interesting analogy. I wasn't thinking of this exactly, but I guess it's working through here. It's not that they weren't in any way efficacious, but they were never perfectly and finally efficacious offerings, right? So it wasn't, in other words, that there was anything wrong with the direction of the worship of the temple. It was its ineffectiveness, right? Because there was no perfect victim and there was no perfect high priest to offer it, right? That's the theology of the Epistle to the Hebrews, right? So there's an analogy there between the way in which Christianity understands its relationship to the worship in the temple, right, and the way in which the thinking now occurring understands its relationship to self-conscious thinking that precedes it, right? That it's not so much that there is, it's not so much a criticism of the direction of modern thought, it's a criticism of its essential capability to achieve what it set out to achieve. So there is I just want to say, but back here in the text. So the Lamb of God in which God himself remains, the death in which God himself remains for the time being without his Son, is the new covenant in the blood now conceived in essence. God is bereft of God in essence. The contradiction is overcome in appearance itself in essence. The world face to face with God in this magnification of his righteousness, in this perception of God's essential unicity, in which he has seen himself to suffer sin in essence. Now that essential unicity would be, I think, the characteristic way, I think it's probably what I really, one of the good things about teaching this course is that I've come to, as you can tell, focus on this notion of simplicity. And it's in the text, but it's not emphasized the way I'm emphasizing it in reading the text. But when you come across the word unicity in this text and in foundation, right, effectively it's pointing to that same thing. In other words, that the unicity of God is such that God can suffer sin. The unicity of God is such that God can become incarnate without ceasing to be divine. That unicity, that quality of unity is so perfect in the Godhead, right, that there's nothing, so to speak, that it can't do. To state it in crude terms, right? So unicity, essential unicity, is something like this absolute simplicity.
So does God become identified with sin?
Okay. I want to say yes and no in the sense that in whatever way he does not, or whatever qualification. Yeah, all right, let me start by saying yes, but then the qualification on that yes is that does so in the mode of suffering it, right? Or suffering the appropriation. He suffers being appropriated by sin. So in a certain sense, he identifies himself with sin for the sake of doing away with it, but not in any simple, unqualified sense is God identified with sin. It may be said that God himself suffers the death of faith in essence, that he himself stands in the essential locus of the individual, kind of the substitute. That's what reminded me of this page. In the locus, in the essential locus of the individual, that God absolutely is the essential individual, that God being first Christ, the individual in essence, is God in essence. All right, now I'll slow that film down because it's relevant to an earlier question that Jim was asking, right? That God himself absolutely is the essential individual, that God being Christ, the individual in essence, is God in essence, right? So in other words, it's the notion that the individual in essence is God in essence. The condition on that is the first part of that sentence, God being Christ, right? So Christ in that sense, the notion of Christ as the mediator, right? Now that mediation is not seen in this hierarchical heaven and earth, this world and another world mode, right? But as it were, leveled out, right? In a world of a kind of complete novation, right? A world without depth, all right? So then the mediation that Christ is a mediation in which, just as the end posts of the beginning and the end are incorporated into the unum, right? So into the Christ as the mediator is incorporated, if you want, the creature and the creator, right? In such a way that the if I can put it this way, the three of them, you see, coexist differentiatedly in, however, an unprecedented unity. I want to say an unprecedented unicity, you see, which is shared in by the normal, as it were, individual, right, and the Godhead. Right? Where here, in a non-Eckhart-ian way, in a non-mystical way, the Godhead is not something beyond the Trinity. Right? Where the Godhead is the Trinity, and the Trinity is the Godhead.
But why isn't the Godhead that simplicity?
It is. What do you mean?
Oh, but I mean, even in the Eckhart-ian sense, because as you read, at least in my reading of Eckhart, it has that quality. There is this quality of a movement towards a simplicity which is accessible to a person through that idea. That's the way it actually functions in the sermons. It seems to me.
Well, that's true, but he doesn't take it.
He doesn't say it.
Take it to the next level.
That's right.
See, this is the next turn. TNO is the next turn.
I agree.
Yeah,
There's a resonance.
I'm glad Elliot's here.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. All right, so one of the ways in which I phrased it, which I thought was useful on page 375, bottom half of the page, well, probably begin right about the middle. The magnification of the divine righteousness, in essence, the complete joy of the Father and Son in existence itself, now perceived in the substantial reality of transcendental death. And transcendental death here, as I think is made explicit in the text, is really the death of self in consciousness, all right? Is the absolute acceptance of the world's being itself in essence, the sin in which God is God, in which God is spirit, in which it is manifest that in fact man in essence is not God, but that man in essence is Jesus the Nazarene, which goes back again to the point that I was making in response earlier to one of Jim's questions. So that the individual absolutely is not simply man in essence, nor is he God, but God in essence, or the essentially transcendental embodiment of God. Here, in that sense, Christ is perfectly substituted, as it were, for the individual. No longer is the individual confronted with the necessity, in essence, of positing his existence before God. Now, in fact, he is relieved of that necessity, in essence, by God's identifying himself with the existence itself of the individual. If I put it in moral terms, which I think are important here, to state it this way, because in effect I think I do, but I don't know that I actually do, how explicit it is. In other words, so if God but it's also, it's not just moral. Here I'm tempted to say the distinction between the moral and the ontological is probably gone. Although you could probably focus in on the moral, you could pull it out of the text. But what I was about to say was that here the creature now participating in an unprecedented way in the unicity of the Godhead, and the corollary or the reciprocal of that being that the divine simplicity is so absolutely unqualified that it shares in the creaturely existence, right? But it does so by way of this perfect substitution. So where I'm going is that the creature now is constructing, as opposed to reconstructing in the self-conscious way, constructing the immediacy, which is the identity of the consciousness, is doing so I could say, in place of the divine creation, or the divine creator has identified with the existence of the creature. That identification concretely means that the creature now is creating the world, right? Not without this move. You see what I'm saying? But substitution still remains an important notion. Because it says, as the text says, this is not to say that God is man or man is God. You see? That would be a self-conscious way of doing it. That's Hegel's way of doing it. Right? Maintaining this otherwise infinitely too subtle distinction, which can only be made in the absolutely unqualified simplicity of the Godhead who is doing this at this point in history. Okay. 378 and following. So in the fifth line on page 378, what now occurs is the formal repetition of the essence of history, which occurred absolutely before now in time, in essential fulfillment of God's promise. Before now the Word was made flesh. Now the Word is spoken in essence. That is, Christ's imagination is now flesh. An occurrence absolutely beyond the imagination of man, the existence itself of the essentially transcendental, appearing now infinitely transcendent, except for the synthesis of the fact itself in an essentially new thought, now occurring for the first time in history, in which man is essentially identified with a transcendent substance, that is, with the imagination of God in essence, with the imagination of Christ, Jesus the Nazarene. So, the imagination of Christ is here identified with the transcendent substance, right, with which, as it were, in turn, I understand this is all slowness induced by the time it takes me to say this, the transcendent substance is identified with humanity, essentially, right? That's the identity of consciousness being the object, right? This object now here being understood to be what? Christ's imagination, now flesh, right? So in a certain sense, the identity of thought is Christ in the flesh now, which is understood here to be my sensible experience. Right? So the notion, so remember, the whole framework here is the mass, is the notion of transubstantiation. You see, flattened out so as to obliterate the incipiently self-conscious distinction between appearance and substance. So here, where substance is appearance, right? The substance here is the body and blood, you see? And so my sensible experience is the experience of the Eucharistic Christ, if I put it that way for shorthand, you see? That's what I'm experiencing. But I'm not just, I have to be careful. I am experiencing it, but it's not that I am experiencing it as something other than myself, right? There is no I apart from this experience. There is no I that's other to that objectivity, right? The objective, or as it was said in last time's reading, transcendence itself is the identity of the transcendental.
The actual operations of apparency.
Okay, you want to elaborate a little bit?
That what we experience is itself the transformed flesh and blood.
Okay, all right.
Those operations are actual, and that's what it is. It isn't something retained back there with a schema that interprets it in that way, or that has a subjectivity that perceives it in that way. Right. The perception as is already that happening.
Yeah.
That's
but going back to my my attempt to clarify the notion that the schema is not simply thrown away, but it is itself, as it were, transformed so that it now, using this idea of substitution, it's as if the schema has been substituted for some putatively original, unpenetrated reality. You see, when I think either the last meeting or the meeting before, I was talking about in the text somewhere about how the essence, we go from essence to form to matter. And it was in the context of the spirit penetrating first, essentially penetrating in the historical incarnation, and then the formal penetration of the spirit being the transformation of first thinking, consciousness, and then the political and social and you name it, transformation of the world that we're experiencing, both technically and sociologically and in every other way. And so the thinking now occurring is that moment, that time, if you want, historically, in which the spirit now has thoroughly penetrated not only essence and form, but matter. All right, and so the transubstantiation of the very matter. So what made me think of that's to say that there's no longer any notion of matter as if, well, that's potentially intelligible. That you say that matter is that which can be made intelligible, that can be formed, right? So matter, the body itself, is to say that the world is, and it's this kind of paradoxical way of saying this penetration is the same thing as the absolute superficiality, the absolute flatness, the absolute lack of depth, because in effect there's nothing beyond the intelligibility, whether you're going up, down, inside, or outside. Right? It's all perfectly intelligible in principle. Right? The matter itself has been penetrated. Yeah.
If you'll forgive the expression.
No, I is a good term.
Is it?
Oh, absolutely.
Me is bad.
Me is bad. I is good. Self and me are bad.
Well,
I is good.
I notice
Good.
in this colloquy here that when we talk about my sensible experience, that's a no-no.
No,
But
why?
when we talk about our, or as Chuck put it, when we have this sensible apperception, that's more PC. Now,
NYPC, you mean? NYPC.
Why PC?
NYPC.
NYPC?
New York Philosophy Corporation.
Oh, good, that's right. Excellent. Very good. Is that something that I have noticed that is not really the essence of things? In other words, that you follow what I'm saying?
I do. I think it's a valid question. Again, as so many valid questions, not necessarily an easy answer, but I think what the ambiguity that you're picking up is that in our language, we is less likely, although in the case of Nazi Germany and other places around the world, and by the way, we don't have to go back in history to find, you can go to Israel or Palestine.
Well, let's go back to the Inquisition.
Whatever. But the point is that there's always, right, we can be used as us against them. On the other hand, just linguistically, it's a little less loaded to begin with. You need a context to make it really loaded, you know what I'm saying? So we tends to be more or less implicitly less loaded with self-reference, a little less, relatively speaking, than my. But I don't think, to me, this is something we can work on. But I think I hear what you're saying. And I would say that my is fine as long as the my is just a way of speaking of the I. If one is speaking as I that's fine, because I in the thinking now occurring is not a self. But this is not to say the I doesn't exist, and it's not to say that the I is not an embodiment of the divine unicity. And among other things, the divine unicity means, in terms that Adams was raising, it's another way of saying a divine simplicity, a divine particularity, right? So it's not a question of the last thing. This goes back to his question earlier. The last thing that the thinking now occurring is quite the contrary. The last thing it's trying to do is to eliminate the particularity of personhood. It's to say that there is a kind of perfect particularity, which the perfection of which consists in or is illustrated by the fact that it's no longer a matter of ownership.
So our is just as bad as mine.
Huh?
Well,
Who you are
no.
and why. It's
No,
the possessive. It's the implication of ownership and therefore self. That's the
Right, but all I'm trying to say is that, I mean, there's no question, but ownership, the notion of owning, and the notion of possessing. Well, I have to be careful here. The notion of owning, because you can possess without owning. It's very hairy. Now, these are subspecialty type questions, you understand? And in that sense, Chuck is right. In other words, there are certain issues. The place you're coming from is another, the philosopher would say, you're coming from another region in which we would have to say, what are the implications of the thinking now occurring in this context? Okay? So it's really not immediately germane here. However, since you raised the issue...
It's not a matter of property, it's a matter of owning.
But you can...
The Bible uses the term own, but you own Christ. You own up to. You confess.
Right.
Okay. So it's
okay.
a question of owning this concept, or owning up to it, or confessing it, or confronting it. I guess if you confront it on its own terms, you lay down yourself in front of it.
Maybe not. See, maybe that's not really what you have to do at all. Maybe
Don't you?
No. Maybe the process is something quite different from that.
What is it?
Well, I mean, in the sense that
We're going to preserve ourselves. We're going to save
No.
ourselves.
Well, those aren't the only.
No, we're not going to
alternatives.
save ourselves.
Those
No.
aren't the only alternatives. It's the erosions of selfhood take place not necessarily by the act of the self of saying, okay, now I am going to lay down myself in front of this text, which is what the problem that you're seeing. You've got the text there, which seems to be for 30 years making a demand on you, or 40 years, or however long it's been making a demand on you, which you're in a tussle with, which in a certain degree we all are like that. But the way in which it may make its inroads may not even be the text itself. Maybe the actual fact of our being in this particular moment in history and relating to this text has a process that you're undergoing that's not at the site of where you're holding yourself and this text is fighting you or you're fighting the text. Maybe it's just not at that level. Or at least that's where I'm sort of handling it.
You
Yeah.
had made distinctions between, I think, spirit and then becoming form and then matter.
Right.
And I'm just wondering if you see any priority temporally to thought before matter, as if thought has an effect on matter and therefore matter itself changes. The transformation of matter is not a result of thought.
Right.
But what I'm trying to see,
Right.
how far you see thought extending. Is matter thought?
Right. Yes.
Okay.
Right.
Okay, now, in your 19th century pragmatic universe, there was this huge issue of panpsychism.
Right. Right.
More prominent in James than in Peirce. And so at a certain moment, it sounds like it's going there. Or as if, only maybe perhaps not as a doctrine announced for all time, but as an event in this theological adventure. That's to say, it becomes panpsychic. The matter wasn't thought.
Right.
In the past.
Right.
The separation between thinking and material in the thinking of the past wasn't just in the thinking of the past.
Right.
It was actual characteristic of being. And that has in fact occurred. That the thinking now occurring, and the Novitas Mundi, in addition to the Novitas Mentis, is that the panpsychic ontology is what's is so now. In a sense, it wasn't so before.
Well, if I were going, I'm a little uncomfortable with.
Well, I am too. That's why. It's
Yeah.
sort of,
But however,
funny 19th century idea.
if I'm hearing you correctly, what you're saying is that the difference would be that the thinking now occurring, if we were to lay over the panpsychic idea on it, the difference would be that if there's any panpsychism here, what the thinking now occurring is saying that this is new, that
Yes,
this was
it's
not,
new,
and so that would distinguish it from your 19th century model, right?
Yeah,
Okay.
And,
So
and like presently, there is. I wrote a review of a book by a contemporary evolutionary and complexity chaos theory type guy book, in which he starts out by saying, I'm not going to say anything about consciousness. Nobody's ever said anything intelligible about consciousness. And then he gives an analysis of what he considers the nature of agency to be, the nature of action, in terms of complex relationships between systems in thermodynamic disequilibrium. A passage, you have one system that's at some particular order of disequilibrium and another, and the change of energy creates a situation such that there is self-emergent activity that continues organized forms in the universe. And he has a very, very interesting history of this. And my point that I make is that, well, if you disconnect the question of consciousness utterly, you can't tell whether this is a reduction of consciousness to matter or whether it's panpsychism. And that therefore, though the description is very elegant, it in fact raises and completely misses the essential question, because it simply refuses to do that. And it seems that this is committed in the direction of a materialism, a materiality, which could very well admit such structures, self-organizing universe structures, in which there is the emergence of intention and the emergence of activity and the emergence of neganthropic phenomena naturally. But it would be clearly on the idea that there is a presence of mind throughout the material, all the way down. In other words, mind all the way down to the elementary particles and to space and statistics itself, rather than a reduction of mind, such that there is no mind all the way up.
Right. Okay. I don't want to go down that because I'm.
No. Okay.
Yeah,
Sorry.
okay.
But
those
I'm
are.
just trying to tie all my little issues in here. Somehow.
I understand, but I can't solve all.
I'm not asking you to solve it. I'm just
Okay.
sort of
All right. Okay.
Well, it's just that I don't want you to. You're not. Sometimes you sound like you're going in the direction of AI, robotism, and complete eliminativism, as they say.
Right.
But I don't think that's where you're going. Right.
Yeah. Okay. Let's see. I think it struck me the pages 388 and following were particularly to
We
the
have
point.
your word on that, right?
I'm sorry.
That answer, we have your word on that. You're not editing that, right?
Good.
Well, you seem to be suffering a high degree of anxiety about all of this.
Oh, absolutely.
Hundreds of robot
All right.
errors.
I just picture the Grand Inquisitor.
No. You see, the Grand Inquisitor was trying to save. He was trying to assume the responsibility for others. That was his problem. He was not a bad guy. He was very well intentioned, but he didn't credit the flock with the ability to face up to reality. So this gives a lot of credit to everybody. We really don't need.
There's a distinction between being a bad guy and being well-intentioned. And let's not get into a whole other subject, but there are lots of people we could cite in contemporary life.
Oh, right. Okay.
You can be
All right.
well-intentioned and be a very, very bad
Well,
guy.
that point is well taken. So let's say he was not badly intentioned, but he was well. You know what I mean.
He's a great guy, right there.
He did not.
Lots of
He
other
did
things.
not. He was trying to do
God's work.
right. Exactly.
Yeah, good for
Okay.
him.
But there's no attempt to do that here, so you don't have to worry about it.
Take your word.
Okay. On page 388, about 8 lines in, there is now absolutely no necessity of being related to existence itself. Existence itself is immediately there. The unnecessary repetition of creation itself absolutely unconditioned. That is, existence is there in an immediacy itself conceived in essence to be the way itself of the word, an immediacy not other in essence than thought itself, but the essential form of individuation. I think that sentence more or less ties together some of the most fundamental notions in one fairly intelligible sequence. In the essential conception of the absolute synthesis of life itself now occurring, everything exists in essence in the essential individuation of existence itself. The miracle of the loaves thought absolutely. All right, so the miracle of the loaves is a making a multiplicity where there naturally would be thought not to be able to be made. So it goes back to this idea of the distribution of being itself. Everything exists in essence in the embodiment of another existence itself, in being absolutely at the disposal of another, in being the servant of a master who reaps where he has not sown. Essentially, faith is a superfluity. Existence is an absolute superfluity. Now everything exists in essence in the body itself, in faith absolute, the love for others in essence of existence itself. Now creation itself, all right, and the love for others in essence, therefore, and this in a kind of paradoxical way would be relevant to the reference to the Grand Inquisitor, right? Who, if I try and revise in terms of Pat's objections, who at least in his own mind was involved in a love for others, right? But a love for others in essence, all right, transcends the matter of opinion, all right. So that, as I say somewhere coming up here, if we get to it, that what is going on here is the memory of existence itself, not the memory of things in the past, right? So the substitution of the divine unicity for, or substitution of the divine unicity in the form of the absolute unicity of persons is in principle, essentially, a matter of, I mean, if you want to speak of any relationship between others, none of whom are selves, right, it would be, in principle, the embodiment of the divine love. It would be, in principle, a matter of the embodiment of a perfection of love, and certainly not of any kind of self-aggrandizing instinct. All right, that is, existence is there, conceived in essence to be the way itself of the word, and immediately not other in essence than thought itself, but the essential form of individuation. I'm backing up there. Drop down in the sentence. Everything exists in essence in the embodiment of another existence itself, and being absolutely the disposal of another. Another sentence down. Now everything exists in essence in the body itself, and faith absolute, the love for others in essence of existence itself. Now creation itself exists in essence in thought. The love of existence itself is absolutely intelligible, the absolute unicity of existence itself. Conceived in essence, existence absolutely spiritual is the body itself. Creation itself is now absolutely the temple of the spirit. Thought is now not the absolute religion, come to maturity in self-consciousness, and there I specifically have in mind Hegel. But now, for the first time in history, thought is the absolute faith, conceived as the essentially transcendental embodiment of existence itself, the perception itself of the body in which all things together with us live and move and have being. The conception of existence itself is essentially transformative of the universe into a state of absolute perfection. And over on page 389, in the fifth line, now everything is an absolute phenomenon without being, in fact, non-existent in essence. So another thing I thought I should say in this closing episode here is that not only is the perfect substitute not the discarding of the schema, but rather the transformation of the schema such that there is the schema is in effect perfectly substituted for what would have been a pre-self-consciousness immediacy. But if we put it in phenomenological terms, right? When I spoke earlier, which I think I only actually make explicit in Foundation, of an absolute epoche, when the distinction between the substance or the existence and the phenomenon is completely, absolutely out of play here, right? So in that sense, if one imagines that the phenomenon is in historical terms understood in some way, historically, not here, okay, to belong to consciousness, right, as opposed to the substance, right? Here, what previously would have been understood to belong to consciousness as opposed to the substance is here identified as effectively the substance, but not belonging to consciousness, but being the gift of identity to consciousness, right? That is affected ultimately by creation and by the incarnation, or affected ultimately by the divine unicity, which the unconditional absoluteness of which is such that it can be so shared, so at the disposal of another. So if you look at the at the disposal phrase from the point of view of the divine, as it were, okay, it's as if the simplicity of the divine is so absolutely unconditioned as to be absolutely at the disposal of the creature. I almost want to say, I don't know whether to actually say it, but I mean to fess up, right? The transcendent itself, which is the identity of consciousness, is the body and blood of Christ, right? That's the basic move here. But it's worse than that. That the divine unity is so perfectly at the disposal, it's as if, speaking a little loosely, it's up to us, you'll pardon the expression, what the body and blood of Christ is. You see? When the divine puts itself at the disposal, being absolutely the divine, right, it can, as it were, afford, right, to leave it up to us, so to speak, as to what Christ is.
Is that not the same? But tell me about the similarity between what you just described and what happened when we, let's say, began to live in a Cartesian world. In other words, when the thought of somebody who is not the thinking now occurring became the shape of the world itself. Is that the same as God leaving it up to us to create what?
Well, I would say in some sense, yeah. In other words, it was the too quick appropriation of a gift that God had given to creation in the incarnation. Yes. Well, but that's just an extension of the gift that God gave to creation in creating creation. Okay. So yes, that creation is a giving without strings. Modernity is the reception of the gift self-consciously. All right. So the appropriate reception of a gift absolutely without strings is an absolutely unself-conscious reception. So yes, there is a connection, as it were, or an anticipation in a self-conscious mode of the thinking now occurring. Yeah. And on this point, at the bottom of 390, it is 5 lines up. It is now an absolutely unexpected offspring, as it were, of the church come into existence itself. Being itself is that absolute motion in which it is immediately perceived that God has committed himself in essence to history itself. And without ceasing to be God, because of this absolutely unqualified simplicity that is now clear in the thinking now occurring, refrains absolutely from the determination of events and exists now absolutely through the body itself, which body itself is that which constitutes our unprecedented simplicity. This motion itself is materially existence itself, in essence the absolute displacement of space. The motion, let me just pause there. This section has echoes back to alpha. Yeah. And when I was trying to translate into my more recent dialogue with Steve Hoth, the symbolism at the end of alpha, and I said on the board, T equals the square root of MC, and that was Maxwell's the square root of MC was and then was the Maxwell's understanding of charge, which I was contrasting with the potential energy in Einstein's formula with an actual energy. I said that Maxwell's understanding of charge was that charge was what happened when things were displaced in space, right? Notice here, this is more radical, right? So it's not a simple return to Maxwell, but again, there's a kind of anticipation, a kind of analogy, that here it's not that things are being displaced in space, but that the thinking now occurring is the displacement, the absolute displacement of space, right? Okay, and the motion itself of the world's being, that is a being absolutely placed in which it is seen that the world is everything in essence, in which is beheld the absolute passion of existence itself. And, here's the memory one. On page 394, fifth line, reality is understood in essence in accordance with the word, that is essentially transcendental. Reality is existence itself. Essentially, it is not, therefore, a matter of the point of view, but in fact a different matter in essence, which essentially does not exist at the expense of another. All right? This is not yet another, albeit final, movement of the self in essence. This reality, logically consistent in essence, is the perpetual weaning of everything in essence, everything absolutely transformed into independent being, into the memory of existence itself. Now, memory is being used here in a technical way and not in a chronological way, right? In other words, psychologically, going back to Aristotle, Augustine would understand this, and probably modern psychology probably has analogs to this. Memory, in this sense, is the capturing, so to speak, of our experience. So sensation is a form of memory, right? So the memory that we think of, that we have after we've stopped sensing, is a kind of extension of the memorial structure of our experience of an objective reality, right? So what's being said here in the thinking now occurring is that what we remember, by which I mean here and now, right, in what we're experiencing the body, right, itself, is what we're experiencing, what we are the memory of is existence itself, right? And essentially so. So you could say we are the memory now of the transcendental essence of existence, and as such, of course, perfectly independent in existence. You see? Because each entity is the memory of existence itself, because of the absolute distribution of being. Right? I think I'll end there because the clock. And before we, do you want to take a break? Well, look, before we take a break, are there any immediate concerns, or should we take a break?
Well, you didn't do Antichrist.
Maybe it'll come up in the discussion period.
I have Antichrist for dessert.
I want to say, because I know there are a couple of people who will not be staying later, right? So I want to say something to you as a class. I want to say I'm very grateful and thankful to you, each of you individually and as a class, for this opportunity. This has been very, very stimulating, constructive, good for me to go through this exercise. So I've gotten a lot out of this. I hope you got half of what I got out of it. I got a lot out of it. And so if you got something out of it, that's good too. I hope you did. But I'm just very satisfied in a very deep sense to have had this opportunity, and I want to thank you for that. So, you're here.
Thank you.
And there are some exceptions to that. So,
well, it was wonderful.
I do it off the cuff. Let's see.
The posters in the back of our mind.
Are there textual questions or general questions?
I have lots of general.
Okay.
Maybe let these guys start.
Should we start with the Antichrist? Yeah, I thought I got the Antichrist thing.
Oh, you okay? Maybe, Ali, you could explain it to Chuck?
Oh, maybe.
Why do you explain
I
that?
don't know. I'm asleep. Let me see.
Why are you going to explain
Let's see, where is it?
Antichrist.
Well, you did once, actually. It came up already, but it
Oh.
didn't satisfy me.
Let's see, where is it? It's on 387.
Mm.
That's the first mention of it.
I think so. Well, I can't swear to that. It's the first time I noticed it. I think that's the key passage in any event. And it's being contrasted there on page 387 with about 10 or more, 12 lines down. It is clear that the essential distinction of non-Christian Christian transcendence is no longer intelligible. What is now essentially intelligible is the transcendental difference, Antichrist, Christ. Now this is connected with the notion that the differences of the past are not, they're neither affirmed nor denied, they're just left in the past. So in the overall context of that statement, which I just can't put my finger on now, but it takes place in this, on page 377, in the fifth line, there is now absolutely, fifth line, 377, there is absolutely no necessity to sacrifice those differences now seem to be in themselves inessential to belong in essence to the past. Dropping down about 4 lines again on 377, those differences are now set aside in essence in face of the fact of existence itself without either the affirmation or the denial of the self in essence. What is sacrificed in essence now is the very notion that those differences are other than themselves in essence, and that in effect that they belong, so to speak, to the past. So if you put the statement on page 387 about the distinction of non-Christian Christian as no longer intelligible, meaning not intelligible, not an intelligible distinction in the context of the thinking now occurring. But then the question is, but what is now essentially intelligible is the transcendental difference, Antichrist, Christ. There are a couple of different ways of reading that. I guess the first one that comes to mind is that, going back to something I was saying during the regular class, if the transcendence itself, which is for the first time the identity of the thinking now occurring, if that is the body, in the sense that which the body is matter itself, if that is the body of Christ, if that is the body and blood of Christ in the context of the... So then the only distinction that would... I don't know, only distinction. The distinction would be whether or not that body is perceived or not. Or better, to go back to a question that Jim asked a couple of weeks back, about, which led us into a question of agreement and disagreeing. And I was saying that the thinking now occurring is not essentially a matter of agreeing or disagreeing. It's really, and I was using the analogy that it's a matter of perception. And in that sense, not a matter of argument. I mean, you might argue about whether or not you see, but seeing itself is an immediacy of some sort. So if the object, which is the identity of thought, is essentially the body of Christ, then the Antichrist would not be the one who disagrees so much as the one who will not acknowledge the perception. Right? I think if the thinking now occurring understands itself to be what thinking now is, then the Antichrist would be, how could I say, assuming or taking an essentially unintelligible position. which, although I don't think I've written about this, I'm inclined to think has got to be, or at least I haven't written about it at length or directly, has got to be a matter of will, right? I think the Antichrist, as opposed to the Christ here, is a falling back on will as opposed to perceiving. And I think it's almost, I'm just thinking out loud, and it's almost, although Antichrist is the historical term, I want to say it almost doesn't make any difference whether you're willing, whether you have a positive attitude toward the Christ here, which you say you don't see, or you have a negative attitude. In other words, if the position you're in is one of willing, in the context of the thinking now occurring, it doesn't make any difference, so to speak, whether you're well-intentioned or badly intentioned, or your will is positive or negative. You're in the wrong place, so to speak. You're not thinking, and the object of this thought, the identity of this thought, is Christ. So whether you will see it or you won't see it is the Antichrist in that sense. It's something like that. And therefore, as opposed to the distinctions of the past, it's not really a matter, it seems to me, of labels, right? So those differences, which is to say, not that they were meaningless in the past, or unimportant for that matter, right? But they're not of the essence of the uniqueness of this moment in history, which is.
Would it be like maintaining, feeding, as it were, the positions of self-consciousness?
Well, in effect, I think I'm saying that, yeah. Because I think that self-consciousness is inextricably bound up with will in its root, and again, not necessarily a bad will. So if we credit, which I'm more than happy to do, Descartes with a very positive, benevolent will toward improving mankind's lot, nevertheless, he roots his science in a will, in an act of will, and so that's another way of talking about what I refer to, generally speaking, as the self-restrictedness of the modern project, right? So it's not occurring to it to be perfectly receptive, right? So to the extent to which it has to will its object, so to speak, or will toward its object, that's an index of the distance remaining in that self-consciousness from the lack of distance in the thinking now occurring.
You either see it or you don't, right?
Well, no, I'm not so sure it's that simple. I think what I'm saying is that you see
use
it
that
whether
image.
you will it or not.
But I think people can understand. You put your hand up, you
Right.
either see it or you don't.
Well, I'm willing
when you're
to.
talking about thought,
Right.
there's a schema involved, isn't there?
No. Well, not in the thinking now occurring.
Yeah. Well, how can we? What do we describe this book as? Is it? It's
The body part- it's a-
series of it's words. It's on paper. Yes.
It's a
But I mean-
particular body. It's the body as a particular.
But it's constructed in a certain way, with however horrible the punctuation, with a certain attention to grammar,
Right.
syntax.
Right.
It's to be read from left to right, not right to left.
Well, we don't know. I mean, that's our normal habit, right? Might be better the other way. We haven't tried
Might be
that.
much more intelligent. But let's assume for the moment it's constructed to be read from
Right.
left to right.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, there's a schema here, is there not? I mean, how can you
The schema
have...
isn't the thinking.
Right.
Pardon?
The
Right.
schema isn't the thinking.
No, but the way we have formulated.
Okay. This goes to my distinction in the class between the beginning of the resurrection and the resurrection itself, and that very difficult notion of the not yet that is thought here, And in response to Adam's question toward the beginning of the last class, this notion of the other being of life itself as something, what I otherwise refer to as kind of the utter finality, for want of a better expression. Okay, so at the point of the resurrection itself, then I think your objection would be more. In other words, if the book were still around, so to speak, in the sense of which it is around here, at that point, if we were relying on the book as a place to do the thinking, then we would not be at the state of the resurrection itself. But that's not inconsistent with the notion that where we are is at the beginning of that resurrection. So in that sense, I think Ali is correct. That yes, there's still a certain schematic reality here, and yet it itself is not the thinking. You have to, as it were, see through the schema. You have to understand. Really, kind of in a certain sense, the schema has to kind of disappear.
One has to actually do the work.
Well, but as you think, then the schema disappears. Then you're not noticing the
So you don't use a
atrocious
schema
punctuation and so on.
when you're thinking.
No, I don't think so.
And is that the active contemplation that was
Yes,
mentioned a couple
yes.
of times?
Yeah.
I mean, the book seems to be bearing witness to something.
Yes, right.
And so,
right.
so that's what you've got. You don't have that something particularly, except the way in which it might happen as you attend that witness. But also, I mean, and this is the peculiarity of it for me, my witness is something seems to have been happening to me that makes me able to read this.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the resistances and the problems always have to do with the particularity of what roughly we're calling the schema, the schematic aspects of it. To what degree I can trust the sense that what you call existence or Jesus or whatever actually has the same, bear with me, reference as the thinking that I find myself already engaged in.
Mm-hmm.
I find myself already engaged in thinking a matter to which this material is completely pertinent. And I continue to, it furthers my thinking enormously to be engaged with it. When I, by self-consciousness, self-reference, paranoia, whatever, fear, self-critical, other-critical, my own version of PC, are resistant to it and feel suddenly threatened by it, at that moment, I'm not doing the thinking now occurring either in my own sense or in its sense. At that moment, I'm just simply having a resistance to some kind of thinking. So I'm not sure. That doesn't mean that I'm committed to not doing that as it occurs to me. I probably will continue to do it. Certainly on trying to get clear about this question of the history and the uniqueness of this language. That's still something I'm not finished working out. And when last week Nancy and Alia and Waltraud and Todd and I were sitting around later and talking about it, and Nancy said, well, you have to get really clear on this question that you're trying to ask, so he has to speak to it. And I said, fine, I will do it, but I that's why I want partly, one of the things I want to do. So it's not just that I'm as you put it before, lying down before the text. I'm just undergoing the text in the way that I continue to be doing so.
Yeah, that reminds me of what he said about will, but maybe you had more to say.
No, okay, go ahead. What do
Yeah.
you mean?
So yeah, I was reminded of that, about lying down before the text or surrendering to the text or something. And
I don't think the text will allow you to do that. If you lie down, you're really...
Yeah, like there isn't any way, right, to stick for it to stick in some way. But also, like the point you made about will is also that you can't choose to surrender. That you can't choose to say, I'd like to believe that everything you say is true.
Yeah.
Right.
It's like, that wouldn't do any good.
Right.
You actually have to actually go through it. You have to actually live through it. So surrender is the same kind of relationship to will that you were talking about, whether you say, I will or I won't. It's like as long as you're choosing in that way. It's not the thing.
I mean, I suppose the word Antichrist is what immediately comes up and creates the paranoid image, because then how am I to relate to what feels like really the necessary thing that I'm undergoing, which includes critique, resistance, difficulties, as well as opacities, as well as epiphanies and flashes and all the rest of it. That dichotomizing language suddenly seems like a cold war on the enterprise. That's why I was sort of insisting on that in relationship to what you two guys were talking about before. That if the thinking now occurring seems to be the ultimate downcoming of the walls, and then suddenly there's this, what's just the ultimate dichotomy.
Right.
Is still.
I speak in foundation, in much more abstract terms, of a transcendental dichotomy.
Okay.
And there I'm thinking of a dichotomy, as it were, between an old universe and a new universe. But the dichotomous aspect, which is reflected here in the jarring introduction of just when you think you're home free.
Well, free at least.
I know.
At least with it.
Right.
Yeah.
Is to it. I think it's faithful to the reality. In other words, this has to do with reality. This is not just an idea.
Sure.
Okay. So, and what's being said is that there's something.
It's still not the case that everybody immediately recognizes all this.
Right, and it doesn't. It's not a substitution for freedom, and this gets sticky. I agree with Alia completely. And in fact, I say someplace, probably in Foundation, it's not at all a matter of choice. On the other hand, in a somewhat Kierkegaardian way, Kierkegaard would have a sense of this. The learner's response to the God showing up, his faith or lack of it, is not a matter of knowledge, and it's not a matter. This is Kierkegaard now. Not a matter of knowledge, and not a matter of will, and yet it is, in some sense, a decision, right? But it's a decision that kind of predates, as it were, pre-exists any choice. It's a decision that's so fundamental to one's being, that is one's being almost, right?
But again, there are different ways there's different ways of relating to this, and many of which I can relate to. And then there's one way that suddenly is terrifying. That is to say, if it's in a kind of Calvinistic predestination.
It's not that.
No, but hey, it's the language is there.
Right.
And certainly Kierkegaard is
right.
in that territory.
Right.
So that's just the problem, that you produce a nice neurotic situation.
Okay, that's of course you can't say everything in one place, but I think now that you're bringing that point up, I think I do say. I don't know whether I actually do say it earlier in the text somewhere. I speak of an invitation. Yeah, probably in one of the early, in the epilogue maybe.
I definitely am.
It's an invitation. It's not a.
My temptation to Christianity has always been in the direction of Catholicism, with the idea of suing for grace, as opposed to predestination. And then,
right. Yeah.
in a sense,
Right.
that just isn't.
Right.
Okay, you can have it. What am I supposed to do with it?
Well, the way I interpret that thing in Calvinism intellectually, and it relates to Barth, deeply relates to what I was saying about Barth. I mean, Calvin, as I said in the class when this first came up, I was talking about Jefferson says he should have been put in a straitjacket. Literally says this. But Calvin, is his passion is the sovereignty of God. But he sees that sovereignty in terms of what is certainly, in retrospect, an incipient self-consciousness. And so...
Well, I mean, there are all kinds of, businesses. I mean, we read, I spent a lot of time reading. Did Tom give you his memoir?
He showed me parts of it. I got selective bits of it.
It's really beautiful.
I think he left out all the good stuff.
It's an amazing thing, because first of all, he's ferocious on his own Calvinism. It's amazing how he comes clean on all of that. But at the same time, he's Satan.
Right.
Tom.
The Antichrist.
He's the Antichrist.
Of course, because
This is what you told me when we talked.
Well, here's what I'm saying. So that helps answer the question then, because the way in which he is Satan in a way that's important,
Yeah.
or maybe in the language of this text, the Antichrist. It's not that he doesn't will.
Yeah.
It's that he wills. In other words, it's not
Period.
that he's willing. This thing is saying there is, for the first time, an essentially new universe.
Yeah.
And Altice is like in the position of wanting there to be such a thing,
Yeah.
right? Of willing it,
Yeah.
but not seeing it,
Yeah.
right? Or, and this we don't know, or maybe he is seeing it and insists on willing it.
Well, he's got all kinds of things he's
Yeah,
got to do.
I tend to think that he doesn't see it. Here, we can put them together. He doesn't see it because he's willing it. In other words,
Well, maybe.
the will is the last vestige of the schema.
He's just not for him the great image is the Jungian, Eliadian coincidentia positorum.
Right,
So
right.
he's got to see all of the real evil of the modern world. He's got to keep that in front of his face.
Yeah, that's very
Like,
important.
I remember that night when we were at your house, and he suddenly came back from the kitchen and screamed at you. The word evil isn't even in your index.
We were at his house, I think.
Yeah.
That's right. So
Um,
it's
so
in
there's-
there. I mentioned evil at least once in the new book, just to make
Yes,
Tom
yeah,
happy.
yeah. But I mean, to me, that's the beauty of him.
Yeah.
That's very beautiful.
Oh, yeah.
The degree to which he holds his attention on
Yeah.
all of that stuff.
Right.
Speaking of beauty, certainly to me, the most attractive of the writings of Kierkegaard is his writings on Abraham and Isaac. And we talked about the lamb today,
Mhm.
and how all those lambs were critters simply were not sufficient,
Right.
running back to history. But what about Isaac? I mean, wasn't he?
Oh, he wasn't sufficient, but
Yeah,
he played
but
his
he was
part,
certainly
right?
a
Absolutely.
better lamb than
Yeah.
the others, right?
Right.
And so.
And Abraham was a better high priest than the others.
Yes.
He was kind of,
So what is there to be learned from the fact that even with such a worthy high priest, who on faith is
Mhm.
willing to commit murder of his own son,
Mhm.
who is not just his son, but
Right.
is to be the vehicle whereby Abraham's seed is manifest throughout whatever, right, the universe, whatever. How is it that well, what's the distinction in terms of the new thinking between the adequacy, if you will, of the new lamb, if you will, and what is it analytically that makes Abraham's, after all, he's the father of faith, right?
Right,
That's what we call
right,
him, right?
yeah.
So, you follow what I'm saying?
I think I do. I'm not sure I know what exactly where your question is driving
Well,
to.
all I'm saying is that earlier we talked about the section that we talked about.
No, I got that. I got
the
that.
lamb of the lamb,
Right.
right? And this is the perfect lamb. This is the lamb
Right.
into which
I think the
that
fact.
has become sin.
I think the fact that it's interesting. Abraham's faith, the test was that he was willing to sacrifice his son.
Yeah.
But it didn't go beyond that. In other words, you could say God's mercy, whatever, spared him actually doing it. But the type of Abraham and Isaac is the type of God the Father and Jesus the Son, right? Where God, it's not a matter, bottom line, it's not a matter of willing, it's a matter of doing. He actually does it. He actually sacrifices his son. So I think, I don't know where you, that's why I was trying to, I understand the framework you're bringing up, but I'm not sure what you're trying to find out exactly, but that's my first answer. And, yeah.
I have this is my own internal reading of that. Abraham, we think of Abraham as the beginning of the world of Judeo-Christian religion, from which Muslim religion, the whole thing. But if you think about him in his own world, he is the absolute outsider.
Mm-hmm.
He's the guy who's following this voice.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You know, he's not like, so everything is resting on the absolute commitment to that voice. He doesn't have something else. There's nothing held in reserve. So in a certain sense, since the promise all along has been he will have his progeny, and it hasn't been granted, and his wife's an old lady, and all of that, it's almost like that story is being drawn out to its completion. That he has to remain. That it isn't like, okay, I'm going to be this outsider, cool, because I'm going to be given the progeny at the end. The maintenance of the absolute condition of his own faith it's just like it has to. It's not. There would be a gap in it, and this just seals that gap. So he's going on that pure path that's his only possibility. And then the gesture is, well, it finally wasn't about sacrifice. Because the goat in the bush is sort of an afterthought. I mean, not exactly, but here's my question with all of this, is that throughout the entire drama, from that moment which looks anthropologically, the moment of the replacement of the human sacrifice with an animal sacrifice, it looks as if one were seeing some kind of evolution of consciousness or evolution of morality, or any of these pictures which see, well, you have a series of events in which ancient tribal human sacrifice is being replaced with something that's much more humane, even though we today wouldn't be so happy with animal sacrifices. But that there's this sort of movement towards a crazy, and then I'm just perfectly Hegelian view of it.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
then
Right,
finally,
right.
the Christian sacrifice is a repetition of the sacrifice of Christ on the cross, is a repetition of tribal sacrifice, but sublated to another level. So my question is, in this latest event, in the third event in the cycle, say, from creation to incarnation to thinking now occurring, is the idea that finally we're finished with this kind of ritual sacrifice. In other words, that the entire anthropology is sustained throughout the last 2 millennia, in a sense, through the literalness of the crucifixion in that image. Now you maintain it through another degree of transformation, so it's not the commemorative event in the temple, in the bread and the wine, but it's the entire world. So it's like another degree of sublation. The entire of existence itself is seen on the model or on the image of sacrifice. And so it's like time itself, the very sense of impermanence and the transiency of time is taken as the image of sacrifice, because suddenly you see its transitoriness, its life and death, it's the predicament of existence itself that is seen in the image of a sacrifice, rather than any particular symbolism, any reading of it in some special sense in which an image is taken off, and this is sacrifice, and then there is the sacrificial sacred realm, and the rest is the profane, which gets the aroma of the ritual sacrifice. Now it's seen that the whole reason why there ever was sacrifice, really going all the way back to the primitive to primitive blood sacrifice. What's that all about? What's primitive blood sacrifice? It's got to do with a kind of appropriation of the fact of violence, and the fact of mortality and of death itself. The magical power of a blood sacrifice is the absolute appropriation of a bodily condition. So it seems like seeing it as Missa Jubilea is a recapitulation of the whole bloody history and putting it into the context in which it's most undeniably so. And I know I changed my thought halfway through there.
Well, the thing that's occurring to me as you're speaking, so I'll go with that. I'm thinking, but this is the beginning of the resurrection. So, well, in one sense, it might be a recapitulation or a universalizing of the sacrifice involved with the incarnation. But that sacrifice also, even biblically, is connected with the resurrection. So in other words, yes, there's a sacrifice.
No, yeah, well, sure.
But, all right, okay. So, but now, so to speak, and this is a little bit, are the tapes off? This is a little bit,
I turned off if you want.
no, I'm joking. Like Tom identifies the crucifixion and the resurrection.
Mm-hmm.
Now, he does it, I would say, in the extreme extension of modern self-consciousness. But of course, he has a theological warrant for, certainly for relating them, maybe not identifying them, right? The thinking now occurring in its own way wants to say something like that, if I can put it that way, so that what I was thinking when you were saying this is that the equivalent of or the point, so to speak, that would be in the thinking now occurring, the sacrificial point, the point at which, let's say, there's a perfect evacuation of self-consciousness, which would be a sacrifice, the laying down of one's life or the willingness to give up one's son or whatever. And in the case of the incarnation, on the part of God himself, which is kind of the perfect deal. The equivalent of that point here is this notion, I think, of the fact that the transcendence itself is the identity of the absolutely new, or the essentially new form of thought. That's the sacrificial part. But the resurrection part is that in that receptivity, in that complete evacuation of self, if you want, in these terms, that in that complete sacrifice that's offered, as it were, by virtue of this perfect substitution occurring now, the resurrection side of that, or not even the side of it, see, because it's absolutely one side, as we know from reading Foundation, that reality is the construction of the universe. It is the, or right, the. So, okay, that was my response. So I just, I was a little, I'm a little.
I was emphasizing the transitory death.
Yeah.
Side of it, but I don't
right.
mean to only do that.
So I just wouldn't correct that balance, right?
So now there's a question connected to that. Is this is just my ignorance, is the term Missa Jubilea a traditional term in any sense, or is that your
Well, I don't know. It may have some warrant somewhere, but I'm not worried about. I'm using it.
But it does have the resonance with.
I think it's my recollection is, I'm not an expert on this. I think there's probably some mass during the year where that would be a Jubilee masses. They exist, or at least they did. I don't know what's current. But no, I'm using it in a comprehensive sense now. Yeah, so I think that's new.
One of my lingering questions is about the relationship between the particular history of the perception of being that we see with various moves and counter-moves and different philosophers and the thinking now occurring itself. Because the understanding or the thinking itself that now occurs, what seems familiar, what strikes a chord in me, what I am most passionate about in the chapters that we actually hear about thinking now occurring, at least from if you're relating to this as a text that's trying to prove a point, which I don't think it is,
right.
But if you think about it like that, the point isn't proven as to how we get to the thinking now occurring, in the sense that, so really a simplification of the question is perceiving this history of being and and seeing the role of the transcendental essence of existence and how it is appropriated by modernity and so forth, and how the history unfolds, is just seeing that history and the capacity that we have now to see that history enough to actually be kind of why the thinking is now occurring. Do you see what I mean? There seems to be a large gap between somebody saying, "Oh, I can see that that's how. I can see this critique of modernity. I can see this is how. This is a way of perceiving the history of being." There seems to be this gap between that and the thinking now occurring. You see what I mean?
I kind of do. I mean, I don't know, and I don't know whether I know exactly. I think so. In other words, one could follow the argument, so to speak, of the analysis,
Yeah.
and consider it as something of interest, or right, and yet not be doing the thinking now occurring.
Yes.
Yeah. Is that possible? Is that the question?
Well, many of the notions of radical objectivity and exteriority and,
Right.
and no self and the missa jubilea and all
Right.
of these things don't seem to be self-evident upon the recognition of this particular history of being. It doesn't seem, to me at least,
Right,
that one
right.
necessarily has to come to the conclusion or has to experience
Yes, okay.
the thinking now occurring just by seeing this history.
Well, okay. It's hard for me to be absolutely sure about that. I'm because I don't have the problem. But I'm thinking that the key word there is not necessarily that's true. On the other hand, I think that if one deeply understands the analysis, one is able to do the thinking now occurring. I don't know that it's automatic. I think rather than a matter of necessary, it's a matter of freedom again. I think the guy who came to mind is my friend Tom. So in other words, I don't know how well he follows the argument, but I think he's got the basics. And I think he would fall into the camp of somebody who thinks it's not only interesting, but important and possibly, right? And so, so if I use him as a kind of index, he seems to me somebody who can more or less see what's going on here, but doesn't necessarily find himself engaged in thinking now occurring. So if the question is that a possible thing to happen? It seems that way to me. I think so. And it goes back, it reinforces my notion that the reason I can't leave out a dichotomy like Christ and Antichrist is that the positive here is freedom, but the negative way of understanding freedom is understanding it as a matter of will.
I don't see how you can understand this thinking, engage in it, whatever, without the history, because the essence of the thinking is the transcendence of difference. That's historical.
Well, yeah, but I don't think that was his question. I mean, I think that's another question.
This is the point, and this is in my history, and Adams is an even more extreme version of it because he's later. I was experiencing as a young man involved with modern literature already this sense that there was this taboo going on in Western thought against the sacred. It's a taboo against sacred, you could call it sacred doctrine. So I was looking all over the place. I was looking in William Butler Yeats's occultism, and I was looking in Buddhism, and I was looking in yoga, and I was looking in Christianity, mainly, I'll tell you the Christianity that I knew. Christianity was Dante, Bach, Thomas Merton. There were these Christians that were speaking to me. But it wasn't exclusively Christian. That was the thing. I would also be, and so over time, many of the things that characterized the content of the thinking now occurring had appeared to me, not necessarily as the consequence of modern Western thought, but precisely by looking around the edges, looking at marginal thinkers, looking at weirdos, looking at theosophists, at occultists, at Buddhists, at Chinese, at American Indians, all of that. All of whom seem to be articulating all kinds of things which are said here in the context of this history. Now, I see that I am a product of this history. That is,
But you're also saying something about responding to an absence.
yeah, that was very much the question of modernity. Although I didn't experience it exactly that way. I experienced it as something that was present in modernity in kind of secret ways.
Right.
That precisely in modern context. That's why I always found Tom very, very appealing, because he would recognize. I would see like you and he are opposites in a particular sense. That he sees the presence of the divine even in all the atheists.
Right.
You know, he's got these readings of Freud and of Marx and of everybody. Nietzsche, particularly Nietzsche, is this great hero. So he sees, from the perspective of some kind of an experience of the sacred, he sees it where it's intensely denied in its own context. Where you say it ain't even there where they say it's there.
Well, I mean, Nietzsche is a good example of where we seem to fundamentally disagree, Tom and I. And in one sense, I do see the effect of this history. This atheism that Nietzsche profoundly embodies is unintelligible without reference to this history, okay, and therefore without reference to the incarnation and so on, okay. So I'm not denying the relevance of Nietzsche in substance, even intellectually, to what's going on here. In fact, that's one of the
Dealing with it in
faith and philosophy is very central. But the difference between me and Tom is I'm willing to allow Nietzsche the freedom to say there is no God. You know what I mean? In other words, Nietzsche's intention is not theological in any sense of the word, and Tom interprets him as if he's
Theological, sure.
He interprets him as if he were a kind of a theologian of some sort, right? Proto-theologian.
I'm not saying that. All I'm saying is that in there, it seemed to me that in many modernists' preoccupation with unconventional spiritualities and mythologies and so forth, that's where I was constantly looking. So I learned about the Kabbalah not through my own Jewish tradition at all, but through William Butch's Yeats' involvement with magic.
Right.
You know, and then when I found out about Jewish Kabbalah, I thought, is that the same thing? And then slowly found out learned its history. So the question is, yeah, I can see there is this history, but what I don't see is the way in which all of these very, very valuable and things that I can affirm through my own life's work that I hear in this thinking now occurring, I didn't get there through this perception of history. I got there through saying, I got to look somewhere else and looking real hard. And then it slowly, over the last 30 years, it suddenly manifested. There were people who were actually there to teach. In 1962, there weren't any Buddhists around who were, that you could talk to. Buddhism for me was the statue in the Chinese restaurant, plus Gary Snyder and Jack Kerouac.
But to go back to the question that Adam...
They appeared,
Yeah.
There they were, and you could learn from them. And what you learned was something that, point by point, is analogous to the substance. Not the substance of the history, but where the content of this emptying of self.
Well, I must say there's a book on all that history of yours that should be written.
Well, yeah. I know many. I'm sort of collecting analogous positions. There's a musical theorist that I've been involved with for many, many years named Benjamin Boris, who for years was the music critic for The Nation, and who teaches or used to teach at Bard, and I've worked with him, and I learned his work very, very well. I helped him edit his papers. And he has a view of the relationship of theory to music that has very close analogies to what the Thinking Now Current says, in the sense that, do you know it? I mean,
I'm acknowledging, I'm understanding.
Well, mainly the notion is that every piece of music has its own internal theory, and that it is a thought. Mm-hmm. And so he talks about himself as a musical thinker, and he doesn't mean by that he's got theories about music. Mm-hmm. He means that he thinks in music, and that music is essentially cognitive. Mm-hmm. And then he has a view of ordinary experience that's based on the same thing. Mm-hmm. That there is no experience that's non-cognitive, but that's meant immediately, mm-hmm. rather than in the sense of some process by which experiences is interpreted and then reprojected out in the world. Then there's a whole world of cognitive psychology that comes from this guy named Gibson. You probably know about him, but and Alia has a student named Harry Hunt who writes about this. That also is based on this idea that there is no, it's against the ordinary picture of neuropsychology, in which you have external stimulus which comes into the sensorium and is translated into neurological impulses and then organized by the brain and then somehow weirdly projected back out onto the world, so you see this. And he totally denies all that. He thinks consciousness takes place completely on the surface and that you have a direct relationship to the external world, and there are models of this in history and evolution, that there are like the image is like a paramecium floating moving in a medium with all its billions of little cilia going around, and the way it works in relationship to the presence of a morsel in the theorem that it wants to eat, as opposed to the imposition of a schema upon consciousness, which cognizes things and knows what it is and categorizes them. And so his idea is that his model of consciousness is that we're more like paramecia than we are like computers, say. So there are lots and lots of things that are happening out there that you could possibly very interestingly trace in relationship to the history that you develop. But it seems to me that there's a big gap in your history from the end of the 19th century up until...
I understand what you're saying, but my answer to that is basically that if you were to do an examination, I would say, my hypothesis would be that if you were to go back to the early part of the 17th century, and you look at the meditations, you say, well, gee, there's a lot going on. And then you look around the 17th century and see what else is going on, all these other things that are peripheral to what's in the meditations, and there would be a big gap in the meditations too. In other words, well, no, but the point I'm making is, in other words, the meditations was not an accident. It came in the total environment of the world, of the history of the world at that time, and perhaps codified, distilled, captured something essential.
I'm with you. All I'm just saying is that there's something that I need to do is to think through things that I'm aware of. I mean, I know about Heidegger,
right.
and the things that I've written on the forum was the best I could do at that moment to seeing how that works through. But there are a lot of other things that are peripheral to it, which would create other little links that, one could say, well, okay, the thinking now occurring, where does it happen? It's happening here in music theory. It's happening here. And then this guy is Lawrence's history is, he was a kind of positivist, really. I mean, he comes out of a complete logical positivist tradition, and he sort of rejects that in his own way. But that's where his bearings are. He has no relationship to continental philosophy at all. I mean, I've beaten him over the head with it.
I understand, but that's an example. But positivism didn't come out of nowhere either.
No,
it has a relationship.
Yeah. Sure.
He may not be aware of it.
No, okay.
That's right.
And really, there's another part of the setting for Buddhism is this great Russian logician Cherbatsky. I don't know if you know about this. There's 2 great volumes that were published in Dover. The translations came out very, very early. But he was a early Soviet Buddhologist who wrote 2 volumes on Buddhist logic. And it's filled with what he was aware of at that time, which was Bertrand Russell, and so he's got all the analogies between Buddhist point instant theory and Russellian occasionalism and all of those things. And that sort of has been a kind of presence, really, in the intellectual world. I think it's a very subtle one, but it's one of the things that has mediated Buddhism, is that there has been the possibility of seeing Buddhism through these eyes. And similarly, and I think this is where Altheiser's early interest in Buddhism really comes from, there was this moment in the 50s when you simultaneously had the Japanese looking to westernize their thought and the existentialist nihilism looking to recover some kind of spirituality. And they crossed, so that you had a perception of Buddhism as an answer to nihilism, as a way of resacralizing experience without compromising one's own intellectual conscience. So that there was an actual cross-fertilization there. And that's changed very much. I think that's no longer what's going on, but it's part of the real background. It's why Beatnik's, get into Zen.
Mhm.
For instance, why Gary Snyder and Ginsberg and Kerouac had all that attention. Why, when D.T. Suzuki came to New York, he had a group of artists who came and paid a lot of attention to him. John Cage and Jackson McClough and a number of other people who attended these seminars, and then generated a work which was extremely sensitive to issues that were particularly Buddhist issues. And again, that's all been part of it. So none of it is in any kind of absolute independence of the relationship to this history. But I just think that's a history that needs to be.
Oh yeah, no doubt. Yeah, yeah. And I'd be happy to know that they're doing the same thing in music. It'd be very good.
Yeah, I mean that's really. That just struck me. I mean, I've been working with this guy for 20 years, and it just struck me the other day that this is really.
As a pedagogue,
Yeah.
I'm always suspicious because the student, even very well-informed students, has the natural tendency
to
when
look for
the similarities.
Yeah,
Sometimes at the expense of important differences.
Yeah, well, no, the differences are obvious. I mean, here, this guy is not by any. Although the interesting thing is that at a certain point he switched and he became very interested in religious writings and religious experiences and what people had to say and so forth. After a period of a kind of almost Carnappian blinders.
Mm-hmm. Any other observations, questions?
I want to try to write something maybe in a forum about this. I mentioned
All right.
before,
Okay.
but maybe to steer me in a direction since I won't have a chance to talk to you about it. The question of the notion of a changing essence.
All right.
That's peculiar to me in the Indian tradition. The notion of an essence is something that cannot change and is not conditioned.
In the Indian tradition?
Yeah, in Indian philosophy.
Right. India.
India,
Right.
yeah, the subcontinent, not the.
Okay. Yeah.
And so an essence is something that cannot change and is not conditioned, is permanent. You could say beyond any notion of time.
Yeah. Which is basically where Plato got the idea from
Right.
the Indians.
Well,
right.
or I don't know.
Yeah.
Who did
No, I mean
Probably, yes.
the back of the deep Indo-European background, Indo-Iranian or whatever they would call it,
Yeah.
of Greek philosophy is very real.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, yeah,
Yeah.
and there's a lot obviously there, yeah. But in the Buddhist context, the notion is that essence, both an essence of the self and the essence of any kind of external object, as well as the essence of a conceptual idea or any concept, is critiqued, at least in the kind of Buddhism I'm talking about right now, so that there's some sense that reality is essenceless. That there are no.
Mm-hmm. Right.
There's no essences. And I'm trying to understand what the notion of essence is in the thinking now occurring, and an essence that basically can change,
Mhm.
or that there seems to be some element of tension, dynamism, particularity, complexity within the simplicity of this kind of changing essence in the thinking now occurring. So,
Right. Well, that's correct, and nailing it down is always a little problem in this thinking. But so if you go back in Alpha, if I don't say it, I should have said someplace. I may not put it exactly to this neatly, but the answer to your question is that it's not only that essence changes, but essence in the thinking now occurring, essence is change itself, and that's where I think the dynamic element is everything, so to speak. Right? Essence is change itself. So you could meditate.
And that's
in my sense of the word, meditate.
okay, yeah.
Not the same as changeless change.
No.
really?
Right.
Change.
Right. Huh?
Changing.
Change, absolutely changing.
Essence is change itself. I mean, what immediately pops in my head is some Aristotelian notion of, of kind of a form, a changing form, revealing the essence. The acorn showing that its essence is tendency towards the oak tree or whatever. And I know that's not at all what you're saying, but so
No, because I think the Aristotelian essence is the telos in terms of which change is intelligible. But Aristotle was a Platonist, therefore he was an Indian.
So there's
The
always
essence doesn't change
Okay.
in Aristotle.
Yeah.
The essence makes change intelligible, but it itself is unchanging.
Yeah, I mean, the thinking now occurring to me feels like that aspect of change somehow being what you started in the first class or second class, the out arche. So some kind of totalizing or absolute or completed reality that isn't touched by or broken up by change itself.
Right. Right.
That's kind of
Yeah, well, I think that's correct.
So I have one last question.
Okay.
Okay. This is, in a sense, is demanding a summary of the entire book, but we can maybe simplify that. Which is that so many of the chapters are called, and the whole process has a reference to what is called the clarification of the absolute.
Mm-hmm.
You've been talking today a lot about absolute clarity. So it would appear that you are describing the history of philosophy, the history of the perception of being as that process, a process that thinking has gone through. But how would you characterize like what that process fundamentally is, that process of clarification of the absolute? Is it seeing through, it's not sort of just systematically seeing through veils or, seeing through constructs. It's something more alive than that.
Right, right.
And so I just wonder if that question even makes any sense to you. How would you characterize what is the process of the clarification of the absolute as a process?
Well, I mean, the first thought that comes to mind is clarification probably should be related to the notion of an objectification, or right? So again, you're, the elimination of the non-clear element, the self-reference. So a clarification, and another way of doing it, which I think comes more to the fore in Foundation, although it's alluded to here quickly, an opening of, right, an opening of the mind. So in that sense, a being objective of the mind to what is there to be seen, or a reception of what remains to be seen, in the sense which we were talking about earlier.
Mm-hmm.
So the clarification is the ability, as it were, of thought or the mind to, I don't want to say clearly because it's redundant, but to see, I'm trying to think of, in Faith and Philosophy, when I'm trying to explain what Descartes means by his central cliche of clear and distinct thought, and I relate him to Augustine, who was talking about what in effect was unclear and indistinct thought, to get an idea of where Descartes is really coming from, because he just repeats it all the time, and I don't think he ever takes any time to exactly explain it. He just assumes, right? So the key word there is, it's a Cartesian word, clear. What does Descartes mean by clear? And it seems to me he means a perception that is complete. Right? In other words, because clear and distinct, what's the alternative to distinct? Indistinct. What does indistinct mean in Augustinian terms, or in any terms? It's confused to some degree. It's indistinct. It's not, where are the edges?
Yes.
So, but it's not enough for him to say a distinct idea. He needs to say a complete idea. So it's not just that now I'm going to switch from ideas to perception. It's not just that the perception should be distinct, formal, maybe you could say in terms of the terms that has become significant in this rendition of Novitas Mundi, which is this class, it's not just that the perception is particularized, but that it is distinct and clarified, clear,
Yes.
absolute clarity. So it's the absolute completion of the perception of a kind of perfectly differentiated world. So that, in other words, I'm looking at something distinct without any notion that there's something missing, something that my perception is incomplete, that my perception is insufficient. Right? So the sufficiency of the perception, I think, is related deeply to the notion of clarity here. Clarity. Now that I'm saying all of this, I'm so curious to go back and look at my dictionary and find out the Indo-European root of clear. But
Well, it's certainly got to do with light.
well, I know, but that's too easy. I'm thinking, it has to do with light, and maybe light in the sense that.
Claritas.
Yeah. But I mean, I'm thinking it's completeness. I'm thinking it's a lack of nothing missing. It's clear. Like when you ask me the question, you say it's like clear, right? You got it, but it's not perfectly clear. Even though you may understand exactly what I said, you may distinctly understand something that is said to you, but there's something unclear about it because there are all these things. Chuck has lived this now for years. All these things invading your consciousness. All these things that are competing with it, right? So if you have so clarity, Cladalune, calm.
Did you hear what Voltrop said?
No, I want to come back to it.
Transparency.
Yes.
I was thinking of the German word for it actually. And
Okay,
it's
what is it?
it's
What is it in
klar,
German?
It's klar.
But it has the
And
connotation.
It means it's like you can look through it forever.
Yeah. That's good. That's very good.
Clarifying butter, where
Okay.
the opaqueness
Wasn't there-
leaves.
The word for enlightenment, isn't that,
Yeah,
Ekklaro or something?
yeah, and Klärung.
Ekklaro.
Right. Yeah, and so that's consistent with what I'm saying, that there's an attempt there to clarify consciousness, not just to enlighten, but to clarify. And transparency, I think, is very good because I think that the thinking now occurring is a kind of perfect transparency, right? A perfect or an absolute clarification.
But it would be, as you were saying it before, I was having this event in which the simplicity of the mind that can be present to something is allowed to be what's present to something, rather than all the muck. I keep calling it the internal hairball that you have to get rid of. That normally the consciousness and that which you're trying to think of is all balled up in a tangle. And if the clarity actually can occur, it's not only that the thing gets clear, but the mind itself gets clear.
Right.
Well, that's the punchline of David's little takeoff on Chung Tzu, where he says, if there is I but no me, distinctions will not be made but be. So there is no hairball making distinctions. They're just there without
Right.
a creation of them. That's what the transparency is.
Speaking of distinctions, I had lots of questions actually, but what I'm amazed at as I'm looking at them, a lot of them have been clarified. So today is very productive.
Yeah.
But one question that I do have, and it is a question of distinctions, I always was under the understanding that Jesus of Nazarene and Christ meant different things, were used to connote different things. And it seems to me you don't maintain that distinction. You're using Christ and Jesus of Nazarene in context that seems to me.
All right.
So.
It's a good point. It's a very good point because I noticed it myself when I was doing it. But since it wasn't me, I didn't worry about it.
For me, it was a confusion.
It's important that I indulge that confusion. Now.
I mean, there were different. There was specific
Yeah.
contexts in which it occurs, but it may not be important.
Right. Well, I think it's related without making it. In other words, it's kind of assumed, and in that sense, I don't know that I take any time out to explain it as you're asking me to do. So I don't mind doing it. But I don't think it's you. I don't think it's explained in the text exactly, or at least certainly not explicitly. but I do think it's probably related to the notion that of the depth of the penetration, as it were, of the Spirit now thoroughly penetrating matter itself, so that it's a way of calling attention. Jesus of Nazareth is very much the man. It's very much the human being, okay? Now, we know theologically that Christ, Jesus of Nazareth, is the Christ, right? I mean, so, and theologically, there's only one person there, right? But for me to use Jesus of Nazareth here in places where you might otherwise expect Christ is a way of following out the basic thought of the thinking now occurring that this distinction, it's not that it's a meaningless distinction, but in other words, there's no longer the compartmentalization, and it really allows, I think, an emphasis on the completeness of the sharing in the finite of the divine that can now be thought to be the reality of the incarnation. Right? So it's something like that. But yes, it does raise the question. It does raise the question that you raised. But I think to answer it, I might have to write another chapter. Yeah. Okay.
You remember the question that was asked of Jesus the Nazarene in hair?
No, I don't. But
No.
in hair?
Hair.
That was a text I hadn't read.